Yep. So I'm assuming that all of you are aware about the British parliamentary format. So extensions generally mean within the closing benches, which is to say, what opening government or opening opposition talk about, they aren't really extensions because they are the first sides to actually present that matter. Extensions essentially constitute whatever the closing benches are talking about, because when the closing government is coming in, opening government has already had two substantive speeches, which is the prime minister and the deputy prime minister, which have already spoke before. So that's where like the extensions generally become important. Extensions essentially means bringing any new substantive contribution within the debate, which is not repetitive from your opening bench. So whenever you are in the closing government, you are making any sorts of new contributions, you have new arguments, new mechanisms, you have unique reasons for your arguments. Those form extensions because essentially what you're doing in closing benches is different from what has happened in like the opening benches. So if you ever want to win as a closing bench, extensions become important because they are the only way that you can win. Otherwise, you will take a third or fourth. So what constitutes as an extension? Essentially, new arguments, even new rebuttals form a part of like extension because responsive material is still new material that you're bringing in within the debate. New examples or case studies, new analysis of existing arguments. So there might be a possibility that your opening government brought forward an argument, but they didn't really make it out in a good manner. They didn't really analyze it in a good manner. So an extension can also be mechanistic in nature, where you are vertically extending on your opening bench. So extensions generally are of two types: vertical or horizontal. Vertical extensions generally mean that you are vertically elaborating upon what your opening government has talked about. This generally happens when your opening government hasn't probably analyzed their arguments or the burden of proof that they had to put forward. So it might be a case where your opening government probably mentioned an argument or had a tagline for an argument, but they didn't really analyze that argument. So this gives you an opportunity as a closing bench to vertically extend and give new reasons for why that impact is likely to occur. If you are more persuasive, if you have more reasons for why that's likely to occur, then you can win over your opening benches on new analysis as well. It also includes new criteria. I'll talk about it in like later examples as well. The first thing to note here is that being meaningfully better is significantly more important than quantity of extensions. I've seen this happen in a lot of novice debaters, is that the main focus is just generally on having an extension, is on having new material. But notice that even if you have new material, but it's not relevant within the debate, or it's not able to be significantly like proven to be more important, it cannot win as an extension. So the major focus whenever you're making an argument or whenever you're bringing an extension should be on thinking, number one, why is that the most important thing? But number two, how can I convince the judges that it is more important than what my like other benches have talked about? It's not on the quantity of those extensions. It's not ki I have a new extension, so I should win this debate. It's about even if you have less amount of analysis, which is to say quality over quantity, even when you have less amounts of analysis, you can win with an extension if you prove that it's the most important thing within this debate. How do you prove that? Then you have to strategically place your extension. You have to identify the gaps that exist between the opening houses and how you solve those clashes better. So you have to strategically tell the judges what it is that you're doing new and why it's important within this debate, or like within like in general what's going on. We can move on to the next slide. All right. So I'll just like generally mention what's knifing about. Knifing is explicitly contradicting your opening bench. So if you're closing government, if you're closing opposition, if you're coming ahead and explicitly contradicting the stance that your opening government or opening opposition had taken, that's considered as knifing because you're not directly allowed to contradict whatever they talked about. The strategy to then use here is using even if analysis, which is to say, knifing only happens when you're explicitly saying that your opening bench is wrong. The way to navigate around this is using even if analysis. In that manner, you're consistent with your opening bench, but you're taking the worst case scenario. So this usually happens when your opening government is like probably less charitable, or they don't engage with the best case, or their like characterizations are something which are like less meaningful within this debate. Then you can use even if analysis. Even if what opposition is saying is true, even if like I don't like go ahead with the characterizations or the comparative that opening government like builds, we'll still win this debate due to these reasons. So it's just the way that you're phrasing your like arguments or you're phrasing your mechanisms. It's important to ensure that you don't explicitly contradict. Use even if analysis if you have to engage with something which is contradictory to what your opening government had talked about. Yep, we can move on to the next. All right. So important guidelines. So these are general guidelines that you should keep in mind whenever you are bringing an extension, because like obviously all of you are still new, and it's important to keep these in mind. Number one, adaptability is key. When you're going as an opening bench, you don't have to be that adaptable, because the whatever material you discussed in the case prep, you can use that material. But when you're a closing bench, adaptability is key, because the extension that you might bring forward is also contingent on what happens within the round, which is to say the dynamics of the round, and listening within the round is very, very essential for you to actually, number one, frame your extension in a good manner, but number two, actually decide what extension you want to prioritize within a particular debate. Because in a closing setup, you might have three or four like ideas that you think might be important, but then it becomes important to listen to your opening benches to decide which idea is the most important or which idea I should bring forward. So adaptability is key, because there are certain circumstances where your opening benches are able to take out all the material that you initially had planned out. So given that these situations can arise, you have to be able to adapt to the situation at hand. For example, there might be circumstances that you might have thought about a lot of material, but your opening bench is just very good and the opening bench is able to take out all of that material. Then the focus is on adaptability. How do you adapt? The first thing to note here is the best way to adapt is by thinking of new responses that your opening government or your opening bench couldn't bring forward. Which is to say, even when your opening bench has a lot of material, the opening opposition is going to rebut that material and respond to that material. So there are obviously going to be flaws within the arguments that come forward from your opening bench, because like no team can have a perfect argument in 14 minutes. So when you're closing government, it's important for you to understand and analyze the gaps that exist, so you're able to exploit those gaps better. Adapting is important, because if the argument that you wanted to present is taken away by your opening bench, then you have to adapt and you have to think about new arguments or new responses which haven't been taken by your opening benches. So it's important to keep adapting to whatever is going on and actively listen to whatever is going on. This is where responses become important, because even when your opening bench is able to take out a lot of material, when the simultaneous like opposite bench, which is like LO and DLO, when they bring forward their arguments, this is the time that ideation also occurs. So ideation in a closing bench is not just on the basis of what happens in a prep, it's also what happens within the debate. You might think of a good idea when you're listening to the leader of opposition, when you're listening to the deputy leader of opposition. So it's important to be able to, number one, communicate with your partner that this is the idea I'm thinking about and this is how I'm going to bring it forward. So it's very, very important to be adaptable, because nothing is stable, nothing is stagnant in a closing bench when you are going as member of government or member of opposition. Because when you're going as member of government, the DLO speech also becomes important. How is DLO interacting with the opening government? Is DLO able to take out all of the material that came in the opening government? So whenever you see these kinds of interactions happening, it changes the way you are going to have to approach the debate, given what are the dynamics within the opening benches, and that's how you have to adapt within the situation. I'll also take particular examples so you're able to understand visually what I'm talking about. Number two, listen to the debate as a judge. This is a very important guideline when you're in a closing bench. Critically evaluate whatever your opening benches are talking about. What is a gap? Is there a gap that your opening bench is missing? Think about it from the perspective of a judge. Is there plausibility that's lacking? Has opening government missed some burdens when they were like making their arguments? Are the impacts that opening government claiming just too large and they don't have the mechanisms to prove it? Is there some flaw within the mechanisms? Is opening government not taking the best case scenario of opening opposition? It's important to think about the debate and like whenever you're the closing bench from the perspective of a judge, so that you're able to understand how you strategically need to enter the debate. For example, if opening government misses mechanization to prove their impact, the way that you enter a debate is by bringing those mechanizations out. For example, you think from the perspective of a judge that if I was a judge, I would have thought that this argument, even though it's good, it's not proven because sufficient analysis is not done. Then, when you enter as a member, you bring that analysis out, you bring those mechanisms out. If you think that opening government is very uncharitable and is taking the worst case of opening opposition, then when you're coming out in closing government, you take the best case scenario of opposition. You like concede to the arguments that opening opposition is talking about, and then you make your case. So it's important to understand the dynamics within the debate, so you're able to bring your like placement, your extension out, but you're able to strategically place it within the debate as well, because that's very important. If you think that opening government is already winning over opening opposition and opening opposition doesn't really have a lot of material, probably responding to opening opposition's case is then not maybe that important because it's something that's not proven. Then probably bringing out your own extension so that you can win this debate is something that can also take a priority over just being responsive in nature. So it's very, very important to listen the debate as a judge because strategic commentary wins debates in closing. Strategic commentary refers to you analyzing and understanding and talking about the problems that exist within the opening benches and how you solve those problems. Do you think there's a deadlock that exists between the opening benches? Were both the sides very, very uncomparative? Is there analysis that's missing? Does opening government miss the impacts? And you, if you were a judge, you would have thought that opening government, even though they have a good case, they don't really have impacts within their case. So when you enter as a member now, you talk about and you strategically place your extension. You talk about the fact that even though opening government had a lot of analysis, they don't have impacts within their case. We break that deadlock because we understand from the perspective of a judge, you need impacts to credit their arguments. We'll build those impacts and we actually talk about that. So it's important to see what's lacking within the debate because in every different debates, in every like single debate, different things might be lacking. हो सकता है in one debate opening government has a lot of analysis, no impacts. हो सकता है in one debate opening government has a lot of analysis, lot of impacts, but they don't have a comparative. Then you build a comparative and you focus on taking the best case scenario. So it's very important to take all of these nuances into account. Thirdly, focus on filling gaps. As I've already talked about, no argument is perfect. Even when you are in a top room, never ever think that the arguments that even like top debaters make are going to be perfect because you only get 14 minutes. Everyone have their off days and no argument can ever be that foolproof that you might not find any missing links. So whenever you are in closing, it's important to analyze and notice these gaps because when you're able to notice these gaps, you're able to exploit them. You're able to come in with your extension and talk about these gaps and how you fill these gaps and how you make it better. Fourthly, focus on meaningful contributions. Whenever you are thinking about an extension, and this is very important, think if it's fully proven whether it can win me this debate. Which is to say, whenever you're trying to bring an argument forward, an extension forward, think if I fully prove it in my utopic best case, can I win with this argument? So winning is more important than quantity of arguments. Do you think that you can prove it to be the most important? If you think that you cannot prove it to be the most important, then probably it's not a meaningful contribution. So meaningful contributions and how you understand what is meaningful is by thinking whether you can use this to exploit or to win this debate. It's going to be different in like every single debate depending on the dynamics within what happens, but it's important to try and meaningfully contribute. To try and prove why what you are talking about is significantly more important. You can use various weighing metrics for this. Number one, you can talk about probably that in scale your arguments are better because they impact more number of stakeholders, which is to say government's impacts or benefits apply to 100 people, your benefits or your harms apply to 200 people. So notice this in a manner increases the scale of harm or scale of benefit that you're talking about. Secondarily, you can also include vulnerable actors. There's a chance that your opening government misses a stakeholder which is vulnerable and which is affected by this motion. If you can impact that vulnerable stakeholder and talk about that vulnerable stakeholder, then you can weigh that vulnerable stakeholder to be the most important within this debate. But thirdly, you can also weigh on certainty. If you think that mechanistically something your opening government hasn't proven, then you can in closing government mechanistically increase the likelihood of that happening, and then you can claim that benefits are more certain in your side because of the persuasive reasoning that you provide. So it's important to think, how can I beat my opening bench with these extensions? Am I more charitable? Am I more persuasive? Are my mechanisms better? Are my mechanisms applying to more number of people? Or just in general, my harms are more severe in nature and opening government's harms are less severe. So this is how you try and think about your extension and whether it is meaningfully better. So for something to be meaningfully better, it has to be very distinct, but it has to do something which is very, very different within this debate. Fifth, strategically entering the debate. I've already talked about this. It's very, very important to place your extension in a strategic manner. Obviously, you can come and randomly talk about your extension, but judges would be confused of what you're talking about. It's important to strategically commentate about what happened above. If you think there's a deadlock that exists, number one, how do you break that deadlock? So it's important to talk about the dynamics of the upper half so you're able to place your extension in a manner that it's solving a problem, that it's filling a gap, that it's better in responses. So it's just better to strategically enter the debate rather than randomly pushing out your extension. Fifth, sixth, quality over quantity. I've already talked about this. It's important to think what's meaningful, what can actually win me this debate. And like I like emphasize over this again. Whenever you have an extension, think if I can fully prove this, whether it can win me this debate. If you think it can, then you start making it out and discussing with your partner. If you think that even if you fully prove this argument, it just cannot win in this debate, then probably that extension is not valued, like worth your time, and you should think about like something else within that debate. The seventh thing, why should the judge care? This is very important because in closing benches, you should think from the perspective of a judge. Whatever you're talking about, why should the judge care about this? Probably what you want is that the explanation that you give off by something is important is the same explanation that the judge uses in their oral adjudication. So you want to be so strategic and you want to commentate on the debate in a manner that the judge agrees with you, or the judge is able to see your stance or able to see what you're talking about. Then what happens is when the judge is delivering their oral adjudication, they're able to give exactly what you talked about, and that's something that's that also feels very, very good. So whenever you're thinking about an argument, think, why should the judge care about this? Why is this important? It's very, very unstrategic to randomly bring out new material. Even if you are new, it doesn't matter. Why should the judge care about this? Think from that perspective. Even if you have less quantity of mix, quality is something which is important. Yep, you can. Yep. So during preparation time, so the way that you approach a preparation in like closing benches is different from how you approach in opening benches. Number one, what you can do is identifying burdens. Given that nothing is like fixed in a closing bench, because anything can happen like in like the above benches in like the debate, it's important you are able to identify the burdens. Sometimes what happens is that the like core adjudicator panel has some wordings within the motion that significantly changes what the motion is about. For example, these wordings could be: number one, instead of this house regrets something, the motion is this house regrets the rise of something. Instead of it being via this house regrets this house significantly does this. So there are certain terms that significantly change what a motion is about. These terms look like rise, significance, like break, like some sort of breaking a deadlock. So it's important to see the importance of every single term within the motion and how you can identify those burdens. So it's important to identify the burdens in a closing bench, because then you can strategically comment why your opening doesn't fulfill that burden. If you recognize a burden and your opening doesn't fulfill that burden, you can fulfill that burden and win that debate. Secondarily, focus on breadth of arguments possible. In when you're prepping as a closing bench, it's unstrategic to take one argument and go within very deep within that argument. Why? Because probably the opening bench can also think of that argument. Because it's unstrategic to refine an argument in prep time. It's important to think of the breadth of arguments that are possible. What are the different stakeholders the debate can apply to? Is there a hidden principle within this motion? Are there long-term impacts that the opening government might miss within this debate? So it's important to, instead of thinking within, it's important to think like in terms of breadth of arguments possible. Probably you can think of 3 or 4 or 5 impacts within that debate that you think are something which are viable. Instead of taking just one and like talking about it for 15 minutes, that's unstrategic. It's important to think about 3, 4, 5 of the various claims that you can think about, and just in terms of that, discuss them among each other. Thirdly, deprioritizing very obvious arguments. Obviously, in a debate, there are arguments which are just very, very obvious, which just hit your intuition when you start thinking about that. Probably those are the arguments that opening opposition or your opening government are likely to run, because those arguments are simple, those arguments are obvious. When you're prepping as a closing team, it's strategic to not spend a lot of time on the very, very obvious stuff, and focusing time on thinking about new like nuanced impacts, thinking about long-term impacts, thinking about a different stakeholder that your opening might miss. Your opening might talk about businessmen, you can talk about consumers. Your opening might talk about sports athletes, you can talk about audience. So it's important to think which stakeholder this motion is likely going to impact, and think about all those stakeholders. For example, in a sports motion, the stakeholder could be the sports club, they could be the audience, they could be the coaches, they could be the sports athletes. There are various stakeholders. So it's important to think how this motion impacts each stakeholder and think arguments within that manner, so that you are able to have a collection of extensions that you can use in case, and like just depending on like how the motion is panning out. Fourthly, focus on unique framing and mechanisms. Obviously, in preparation time, you can also start thinking of complex mechanisms or reasoning or unique or creative ideas that you think probably are unlikely to get run in opening benches. So these are ideas that you can focus on. And if you find something which is unique, which is creative, and which is relevant within the debate, you can talk amongst, like, with your partner, whether it's a possibility of you running it as an extension within the debate. The first thing to note here is, a lot of times what happens is your opening misses the obvious claims. When your opening misses obvious claims, it's your job to bring the obvious claims out and not get emotionally attached to your creative extensions. Because sometimes what happens, even with the novice teams, is you have a creative idea and you're very, very proud of that idea. But if your opening bench misses an obvious idea, the obvious idea and bringing that out is more important than bringing the creative idea out, because obvious ideas are more palatable and persuasive for judges to credit. So whenever you're thinking about arguments, even if you like one of your arguments a lot and you think something obvious was missed from the opening benches, prioritize the stuff which was obvious, talk about that stuff, not the stuff which was creative and which you thought is unique. So it's very important to see what happens within the debate, and adaptability is something that's very, very important in the closing benches. Notice when you like do this within the case prep, you're increasing your alternatives and the options that you have. If you think about 2 or 3 impacts on various stakeholders, you have a basket of alternatives to choose from. You're not dependent on your opening, that if my opening ran this argument, I'm out, I don't have anything to do now. If you have variety of arguments and impacts you can think about, then you also increase the alternatives that you can use and run within that debate. Obviously, not all alternatives, not all impacts are equally valuable. That's something then you have to see the debate and understand and recognize what you need to do within the debate. It gets developed with time, but that's something you can do. Yep, next slide. During the debate, all right. So like, this is what I'll say, and like, this is what's essentially true. The best and the major part of your extensions are built within the debate, because most debates, especially in top rooms, are going to be very, very dynamic in nature. They're going to have a lot of claims and a lot of responses. So it's your job as the debater on the closing team to recognize the nuances and recognize what's actually going on, so you can strategically think about what you need to do within this debate. What do you need to do within this debate? Number one, active listening. It's important for you to listen what's going on. So obviously there are going to be times when you're writing your extension down and you cannot actively listen to every single thing what your partner what the teams are talking about. Then what's important is division of labor. You should have clear communication with your partner, that if some things are, if there are some moments within the opening benches where you are deprioritizing listening and you're focusing on writing your extension, then your partner is someone who's actively listening and who can actively tell you if an important thing is coming out or if your arguments are coming out. Obviously, whenever you're writing as well, you should passively listen to whatever is going around so you have a general idea. But when you're focusing like deeply on writing your extension as a member speaker, your whip should essentially listen to what's going on, so you can divide labor between yourselves and you can communicate within yourselves what's going on, what needs to be done. So active listening is important, especially for the teammate which is going as like the whip, because whip is like a responsive heavy speaker and weighing heavy speaker, and the whip needs to understand the dynamics happening within the debate. But communication is very, very important. That communication can happen while a speech is going on. If you're silent enough, please don't be loud. That communication can go on within, like, whenever a speaker stops and a new speaker comes. So for example, when the prime minister stops, you get 45 seconds, you talk with your partner. When the leader of opposition ends, you talk with your partner. When the deputy speech ends, you talk with your partner, and you constantly like talk about the nuances or the developments that happen. Are there any new extensions that you thought about, new responses you thought about? So it's very, very important to constantly communicate. You can communicate through text if it's an online debate, communicate very, very like silently with each other, like not make a lot of ruckus. So it's important to just be on the same page as your partner. Otherwise what ends up happening is the member speech like is a random extension of the whip, is a different speech. So it's important you both are on the same page, because you both have to like essentially make the same case. Otherwise inconsistencies can also happen. Second thing, don't panic. This is very important, and I've seen this happen for novice debaters as well. When you are scared that you don't have anything, when you think your opening is very, very good, you start panicking. You start thinking, or like you start like thinking that I probably don't have anything, what will I do, I'm going to be derivative. So it's very, very important to not panic, because panicking will make your performance worse. It will make you more derivative. If you think worst case that you have no extension, then even strategically having a responsive heavy speech is good. But just to say, if like worst case you probably don't have any extensions, if you cannot think of a new material, then to probably place yourself in a strategic second position, it's also strategic to then start thinking about rebuttals, responses, and trying to frame them as extensions, because obviously responsive material is new material. And if you're responsively very, very good, you can strategically commentate why that response is better. So whenever you're bringing out a response, focus on why that response is something which is better than your opening bench. You can talk about the fact that this response takes the best case scenario of the opposition. This response isn't susceptible to the damage done by opposition, because opening government's claim is reliant on this. Our claims aren't reliant on this. So strategic commentary is something which is very important when you're trying to bring out your extension. Because Mehak. Yeah, I can see your hand is raised. Do you have a question? You can like unmute or ask within the chat box. All right. So if I see, like, I'll see if I see a question, I'll stop within the chat box. Yep. So what I was talking about, it's very, very important to not start panicking, because you'll always have something to do. There will always be a gap. There will always be something that's missing. Even if you think there isn't, it's important to be very, very responsive, but have new responses that you think are important within this debate. So even worst case, you cannot think of new arguments, new impacts, new analysis. You can obviously respond to the DLO speech, because DPM probably cannot do everything that the DLO said. So when the DLO is attacking opening government, you have new responses that you can use and frame them as extensions, especially if you're struggling within your speeches. And that's something that you can do. Thirdly, clearly defined note-taking method. Obviously, like every different speaker, every have a different method of how they take notes. It's important for you to keep doing mocks, keep doing tournaments, so you can develop your own note-taking method. For me, when I go as a whip, I use different sheets for different benches. So I have one sheet for opening government, one sheet for closing opposition, one sheet for opening opposition. So I have different sheets for different like sides. So what some debaters also do is that they use different colored pens for different parts of their contribution. For example, for the responsive material, they use a red pen. For the positive material, they use a blue pen. So you can use these kinds of note-making methods to ensure that you are efficient within your note-taking manner. It's very important, even as a whip, even as a member, that happens is when you're scared and when you don't have an extension, you start writing comprehending what they're talking about. So you can strategically write it in a few sentences or a few words, and then manually comprehend mentally what they're talking about. So note-taking method, whatever suits you. Some people like 8 to 10 sheets. Some people like 1 to 2 sheets. I've even seen some debaters that don't use a sheet. I don't know how they do it. Some people use laptops and they're delivering their speeches. But it's important, especially in an extension-based like bench, to have clear note-taking methods. Otherwise, your speech can become blurry. Your speech can become messy. So if you have clear note-taking methods, it's easier for you to bring your extension out, clearly talk about what you were saying, and be clear in the arguments that you had and were talking about. Yep, division of labor. So division of labor is very important within like BPs, because you as a person cannot do every single thing at every single time. If you're a member speaker, you have to write your speech, you have to write your extensions. Probably then you can talk to your partner that please notify me when something important comes. If like our opening benches are eating up our arguments, let me know. We can discuss and we can decide how to like move forward. So it's important that there's always division of labor. Probably when the DLO speech is going on and you are the member of government, you're going to keep writing your speech. So then your whip can ask the POIs, your whip can engage with the opening benches. So strategically dividing on the basis of what your preferences are, what your strong suits are, is something you can do and discuss among your teammates as well. Clear methods of communication. Again, communication is key, because like things will change within the debate. What you thought prime minister would run, probably prime minister might run something else. So it's important to keep communicating with each other with the developments that happen, how the extension changes. Is your extension gone? Do you need to do something different? What's the general structure we can follow as a whip? All right, so I'll talk about the structure that I follow as a whip. Yep. So obviously, what you do within your speech depends on the debate, but the general structure that you can follow is number one, trying to strategically take out sides which you think are very weak. Which is to say, if you're going as government whip or opposition whip, it's strategic to take or commentate against sides which you think are already losing or which are very weak. and so you can at least ensure that you take 1 or 2 points within that debate. So if you're closing government's whip and you see closing opposition doesn't really have a lot of case, it's easier to rebut them. So then start with the rebuttals against the weakest team, so at least win over them and you are able to weigh your arguments over their arguments. Then you can go after the teams which you think were good, or like are the teams which are the best within that round. The general structure that you can follow as a whip is: number one, extraneous rebuttals. If you have extraneous rebuttals to the opposition side, which are different, which are new, which you think are important, you can start with those rebuttals. Then secondarily, you can focus on rebuilding your extension, because a lot of time what happens is your member is not able to clearly lay out everything. Your member probably misses a link, misses some nuances within that impact, misses clearly bringing out that extension. Your member does enough, but then you have to rebuild that extension. Is there a link my member misses, or is there a link my member doesn't spend enough time on? Is this impact important but my member didn't spend enough time on it? Did my member not build a positive comparative? Because comparatives are also important, because debates cannot be won on a parallel manner. You have to build your comparative which is unique, which is different. So you have to focus and you have to listen like when you're a whip, your member speeches, to decide how you need to progress or how you need to move forward. If you think impacting is lacking in my member speech and analysis is something which comes, then you can talk about the impacts. Then you can like rebuild your extension so it's more persuasive for a judge to buy. You can viscerally talk about examples of those impacts. So even if your member brings out those impacts, you can viscerally talk about it in a form of visualization, in the form of examples. So it's easier for judge to understand and easier for judges to credit it. If you think your member was something which was unclear, that probably the unique contributions are unclear, then you as a whip, after the rebuttals, you talk about those unique contributions so the judges understand what's the unique thing that you're doing. So but if you think that your member is able to specially like prove your extension, prove what's unique, then you can focus on responses and weighing that extension. So probably then you don't need to rebuild your extension because it has been significantly rebuilt already. Then you can focus on individual weighing against each bench. For example, if you're closing opposition, you can take opening opposition, you can take opening government, you can take closing government, and then you can weigh your debate or like weigh your arguments over their arguments against the general metrics they are. Those metrics can be scale, vulnerability, certainty. Like I think your VIP special session has been taken, so you would know these like metrics already. So I'm not going to go very deep within that. But these are the general things you can do. So the general structure is: number one, extraneous rebuttals; number two, rebuilding your extensions; number three, weighing against each individual bench, but choosing the weakest bench the earliest and going after the harder benches later. This is something that I also like implement if I want to ensure that I at least take a second. So it's important to weigh against the weakest benches so you can at least take a point and then go after the main benches. It's not that you won't go after the like team which is the toughest, that you won't go after the team which has most proven their claims, but obviously you'd want to go after them in a strategic manner so that it also helps your team. You probably want to spend a lot of time on that, but before spending 2-3 minutes on the main top contender, it's important you ensure your stability within those rankings so the judge can credit you a second or a third at least within that round. Yep. Next slide we can go. All right. So I have some like guidelines for the member speeches or for what needs to be prioritized. All right. So the most important thing for a member speech is to not go ahead and extraneous rebuttals a lot. I've seen this happen a lot, especially with the novice speakers. Is when your member speaker comes, the member starts rebutting every single argument of opposition, one, two, three, four, five arguments. The focus should always be on bringing your extensions out, bringing your like material out. Obviously if you don't have like positive material, this doesn't necessarily happen because most of the time you will have something, then probably responses is something you want to prioritize. But in most cases you'll have your extension that you want to develop, because members are the only speeches that can effectively develop that extension, because your whip has to do a lot of comparative, a lot of rebuttals, a lot of weighing. So the first thing that's important within a member speech is to only have few key rebuttals within their speeches. So for example, having rebuttals for maximum 1 minute, 1 minute 30 seconds or 2 minutes, but having key rebuttals to key premises of the opposition side. It's unstrategic for a member to rebut every single example that opposition brings or every single random argument that the opposition brings. You have to focus on the key premises and the key flips that you will be making as a member speaker. So if you're rebutting, if you're doing extraneous rebuttals as a member speaker, keep them few and do only the most important ones. This is where also division of labor comes, because you can do the most important rebuttals which the judges need to know, then your whip can rebut everything else. So you can discuss with your whip that you are going to break their premises, or you're going to focus on the most important of the rebuttals. The whip can take out like different arguments or like anything else that needs to be done. So division of labor within member speeches is important. It's very unstrategic to respond for 4 5 minutes, 3 5 4 3 4 minutes. Ensure you only have few rebuttals, but most important rebuttals. You'll understand what is the most important rebuttal you have. Bring that one out. Leave the rest for the whip, or the rest just aren't important, because obviously there's a trade-off you have to make. You might have one more good rebuttal, but that means your positive impact doesn't come out. Strategically doesn't make sense. You can leave out that rebuttal. You can focus on building that positive material. How you should start, how starting your member speeches in a good manner is very important, so the judge is clear of what you're going to do. This is why I keep on elaborating about strategic placement and strategic commentary, because those wins the debates. Because the judge needs to understand how you're entering the debate and what you're going to do, which is different. What are you specifically going to prove with your extension that the judge should care about? Probably in a motion where opening government misses analysis, you can talk about the fact that there are some gaps that are missing, so the arguments aren't proven. So the burden of proof is something which opening government doesn't justify. We uniquely as closing government are going to prove that burden. We are going to give you the mechanisms which are persuasive and required, and we are going to win that debate in that manner. Secondarily, it could also mean that we will take the best case scenario. You can talk about how opening government only takes the worst case scenario of government or of opposition. They are very, very uncharitable. We'll agree with the harms that opening opposition is talking about, but these benefits are more important than the harms they're talking about. So just strategically placing what you're talking about. I have a lot of examples so you understand like what the strategic placement that I'm talking about is. I have like 4 different motions that we'll go through, and so these are my own experiences of how I brought forward an extension and won with it. So I'll use them like as like part of this session as well. Yep. Secondarily, primary mistakes and gaps. Probably when you're bringing an argument, you're probably filling some mistakes, you're probably filling some gaps, you're probably responding in a better manner. So you have to strategically tell the judge what you're doing, how you're doing it. If you're bringing out a response, you have to talk about why your response is better. Opening government's response is dependent on this, our response is not dependent on this, our response is better. Be very, very time efficient. A lot of times what happens is sometimes you have a lot of material to go through in closing, but what then happens is you're not clearly able to lay out the material. So it's important that the most important stuff and the most important arguments gets the most amount of time. You might leave out one new mechanism, new subsequent like ancillary mechanism that you have if you have less time, but it's important that the most important impact you're talking about or the argument you're talking about, that gets clearly like shown. So even if you have to leave some positive new material out, you can do that if you think it's the most important. So be very, very efficient, be very, very clear. Yeah, we can. All right, so types of extensions. This is where I'll take some motions of like where I debated and talk about it. All right, so what is a mechanistic extension? Obviously, whenever you're bringing an argument, you bring mechanisms within that. But I want to be clear what I mean when I talk about a mechanistic extension. What I mean with a mechanistic extension is you having a vertical extension. Probably your opening government brings out an argument, but it mechanistically doesn't prove it. So the way I have like within my like PPT characterized mechanistic debates or mechanistic extension is something where you're bringing mechanisms to an argument which has already come forward. What mechanistic extension is not a new argument, it's new persuasive reasoning or more important reasoning for why something is true, for why something is like occurring. When do you use this extension? You use this extension, number one, where you feel that opening government takes or like has an argument but doesn't prove it, which is to say your opening government might has a fancy tagline for that argument but they don't prove that argument. You can mechanistically extend and prove that argument. You can mention how this burden and this gap exists. Through our reasoning we'll fulfill that gap, we'll justify it. Secondarily, you can also do this when you think your opening government has proven something but your reasoning is just more persuasive or more important within the setup. So even if an argument is proven, if you can use mechanistic extensions to prove why your vertical analysis is more important, you can win this debate. Obviously, vertical analysis is something you have to be clear about, because just adding one more random reason won't win you this debate, and probably you shouldn't focus on that. So it's not कि भाई मेरे पास mechanism है तो मैं बस ले आऊंगा. You have to think about whether this vertical analysis is worthy enough, whether it's important enough, whether it can actually win me this debate. Again, I'll go back to this again. You have to think, can this win me the debate? Should the judge care about this? Is it the most important thing? If you think it's not, then don't bring it, bring something else. I'll take an example of what I did when I was a closing bench. All right. So abhi, like recently Manzar happened. This is the round 5 motion. This house believes that it is better to have had a good thing and lost it than to never have had it all. It's a philosophy motion. All right. So what happened within like opening government? So I was closing government within this like motion. What happened within the opening government? The opening government talked about how it's better when you have had a good thing and you lose it, because you're able to self introspect. You are able to think about, and you're able to take part in new hobbies. You're able to do more stuff. You're able to be positive, and you're able to self introspect and internalize that. So if I've had a good thing and I've lost it, I can self introspect and think about what I learned from losing it. This was opening government's case. But what do we do in closing government, and how do we fulfill gaps that exist? What we specifically do in closing government is that we prove that opening government assumes that you have the capacity to internalize, that you have the capacity to introspect. Because opening opposition was right within the motion and within the debate room as well. Opening opposition just said that you won't be in the capacity to introspect because you'll be very sad. Because if you had a good thing, you lost it, you'll be very, very sad. How will you introspect? That's the deadlock we found. That's the gap we found. That opening opposition asks a fair question. Can you introspect? Can you think about the positive stuff? Do you have the capacity to do that? We prove that in the closing government through our mechanistic analysis. How do we do that? Number one, we talk about the fact that you as a human and you as a general person have self-defense mechanisms, which is to say your body wants to protect itself, your mind wants to protect itself. Insofar as that is true, negative experiences are already eroded in your mind because those cause you harm. Insofar as there's a self-defense mechanism that exists within your brain, you want to prioritize the positive stuff because that positive stuff gives you happiness, but your mind is made in that manner, or it's wired in that manner. Notice how it's a better response than opening government. Opening government said you can introspect. How can you introspect? You can only introspect when you have the capacity to introspect. You get this capacity when you have self-defense mechanisms. Otherwise, you will be sad. We prove that you have the capacity to do that. Secondarily, what do we prove? We talk about religion. We talk about the fact that religion always talks about having a God's plan, right? So so what we prove is you are able to cope with your suffering because you are able to link that suffering with some meaning in your life. Probably God makes its hardest. Probably God like ensures that their like best soldiers suffer the hardest. There's a God's plan that exists. So through religion, you're able to cope with your suffering because you're able to assign value and meaning to that suffering. So we talk about religion in a manner that notice when religion exists, you have the coping mechanisms to introspect. So we become logically prior than opening government because opening government was like, oh, you'll think about hobbies, you'll think about the positive material. Why will you do that? You will do that because religion helps you and allows you to do that. This is how we become prior to opening government because opening government's impacts aren't proven. We mechanistically prove their arguments through self-defense mechanism, through religion. But we also talk about the fact that when you as a person lose a good thing, you blame your circumstances. For example, if you were in a relationship and you get broken up, it obviously it's easier in the start to blame the partner, but what ends up happening in most circumstances is you start blaming the circumstances. Probably number one, the timing wasn't right. Probably two, our value systems were very different with each other. Number three, our career choices were very different with each other. Number four, our personalities were just very different. You can use these environmental factors to cope with your suffering. So what we prove that is unique from opening government is no, we don't go in hobbies randomly. We go in hobbies because we are able to cope with it. That's how we mechanistically extend, and we like won that debate in round 5 in Manzar as well. So this is an example of mechanistic extension. I found a gap in opening, I solved that gap through religion, through self-defense mechanism, etc. So this is one of the examples. So notice whenever I was even like bringing my extension out, I strategically commentated about it. So I didn't start my speech by panel. People have self-defense mechanisms. It's important for people to move on because it gives utility to their life. The judge would be very confused. What did I do? I talked about the fact that panel opening opposition. This is strategic placement and strategic commentary. Panel opening government talks about introspection but doesn't prove it. There's a burden of proof that's missing, and there is less analysis as to how you can introspect, how you can internalize, how you can actually move on or cope with your suffering. Opening opposition is winning on that clash. We'll resolve that clash for you through the mechanisms that we have. Number one, people have self-defense mechanisms. Number two, religion helps with your suffering. Number three, you can blame your environment. Number four, minorities were better off in this motion. Like we had more arguments around that. So what ends up happening is when you do this, the judge is able to understand, so that's why it's important. Because it's important because this is something which was missing. So whenever you're bringing something out in closing, like think about it from the perspective of the judge. The judge should be like, yes, this is exactly what was missing, and this is what I needed within this debate. So the judge is just able to credit it more, so you are able to win that debate more. So identify. So the learning from this is simple. Whenever you're in a motion, identify the gaps, identify what's missing, think of reasons, prove the persuasiveness, prove the gaps, win the debate. This is one way to win debates. Yeah, next we can go. Impact extensions. All right. So impact extensions generally focus on bringing new impacts of existing arguments. Impact extensions, obviously I've labeled them differently, but mechanistic extensions and impact extensions can also be interlinked with each other, because whenever you're bringing an extension out, what you want to ensure is you're not completely dependent on opening government's analysis. So you cannot be like, oh panel, we have a new impact, but opening government still provides the reasoning for it, so you're dependent on opening government. Even so, the thing to note here, whenever you have a new impact, think of new reasons for why that impact is going to occur. That reason might not be the most persuasive reason, but if you have independent reasons for your impact occurring, then the judge is more likely to credit you over your opening bench. I'll repeat this again. Even if you don't have the most persuasive reasons because you think opening gives the most persuasive reasons, even if you have less persuasive reasons, ensure that when you are bringing an extension out, you have independent reasons for why it occurs. Because you cannot be like, panel, opening government proves this, we'll extend this impact to vulnerable actors. Okay, you extended the impact, but analysis to opening government ka hai, then the judge will be like, even though closing government had a new impact, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, even though closing government had a new impact, they were dependent on opening government's analysis, so I cannot credit them over. So you take a second, but you cannot win over opening government. This is something that people hear a lot. How do you solve that? The way to solve that is by having different reasons for why your impact occurs. Even if it's not the most persuasive, wo gaya wo lene do. Just think of still at least one or two reasons जो opening में नहीं आए. Even if you're extending, for example, impact to vulnerable actors, think कि ऐसी क्या चीज है जो opening में नहीं आई, just I can prove the impact towards vulnerable actors better, or just like in a better manner, um, in general. Yeah. So impact extensions, ये होती है कि you just bring a new impact or you increase the scale of that impact. I'll take a Manzar example when I was closing. Yeah. Example, assuming feasibility, this house believes that the school should abolish primary and secondary school grades that group children based on age and instead group them by competency and intelligence. So the binary in this debate was government defended competency intelligence. We were like on opposition कि भाई हमें age base पे चाहिए, like status quo is good. I was closing opposition in this. What did my opening opposition run? My opening opposition talked about how it's in general bad, you're coercing agency, but it's bad for people because people feel bad. But this was the extent to which they talked about it. Their impact was people might feel bad, but that's not the impact that's proven and mechanistically done. What do we do in closing opposition? We prove that fundamentally, when you make these comparisons for people when they're young, their self-worth gets harmed, their identity gets harmed, and they feel more insecure. What do we do in closing opposition? We prove that when you are a teenager, when you're a young person, you're at a very vulnerable age, and you are someone who's generally insecure because Instagram exists, because social media exists, where you see people have living the perfect lives, because peer pressure exists to a degree, so you're just a very insecure person. When you make these comparisons explicit, when you say कि ये बंदा F grade में बैठेगा और दूसरा बंदा A grade में बैठेगा, you are explicitly comparing their rankings and comparing their competencies. So what's the unique mechanism we bring? I'll talk about that as well. We talk about the fact that when you're a young person, you are more susceptible to these comparisons. Why? Because when you're a young person, you don't have historical success that you have. I'll be very clear. When you're 30 years old, when you're 35 years old, even if कोई आके आपको कुछ बोलता है, you don't think about it because you have success and you have quality success that you have. So for example, if I'm a 30-year-old person, I have a 1 lakh rupee job, I have a wife, and I have a lot of awards. अब मुझे जब मैं 30 years का मुझे कोई बोलेगा कि भाई तू अच्छा इंसान नहीं है, तू like you are not competent, I'm not going to believe him. I'll be like, no, I'm competent. I have a good relationship. I'm in a good career. So people derive their competency from the historical experiences or the historical success they have. If you have been successful in the past, you are more competent and you're more secure. But when you're young, you don't have that. When you're a primary school kid or a middle school kid, you don't have a career which you have succeeded in. You don't have a relationship which you have succeeded in. So you're more susceptible to the claims that come from outside, and you're more likely to internalize them because there isn't an objective success that you have seen because you're a young person. So you're more likely to believe that external comparison instead of having that. So we elaborated a lot on self-worth, how it harms your identity. We weighed this also. How did we weigh this? We weighed this on two metrics. Number one, that's the harm on self-identity is the most proximate harm that an individual can suffer. Why? Because if you're not confident within your self-worth, you have to live with yourself 24/7, which is to say the harm on your identity causes you the most disutility because you cannot escape yourself. Because if the source of disutility is your presence, you have to live with yourself 24/7. So notice we prove this is the most important harm within this debate, because if you have self-worth harms, if you're not confident and if you feel like you're not worthy enough, you have to live with yourself 24/7. I cannot escape from myself. If I'm myself the source of my own suffering and I cannot escape it, I feel severe amounts of pain. We weighed using this comparative that your identity and the harm on your identity is the most important thing, because you cannot escape it. Because secondarily it compounds. When you have self-worth harms, you perform worse. आपके grades गंदे होते हैं. जब आपके ग्रेड्स गंदे होते हैं, आपकी आइडेंटिटी और बुरी होती है क्योंकि आपको और बुरा लगता है, फिर आपको और बुरा लगता है, आपके ग्रेड्स और कम होते हैं. सो देयर इज अ कंपाउंडिंग इफेक्ट दैट अकर्स. यू फील बैड, योर ग्रेड्स गो डाउन. You feel worse because your grades go down further. This is weighing. So when we prove हमारी साइड पे compounding harm है because you keep feeling bad, you keep performing worse, that's the weighing metric that we use कि our claims are the most important on closing opposition. Opening opposition like घंटा जाए, their claims aren't important. So notice they just said we feel bad. हमने क्लोजिंग ऑपोजिशन पे आके उस इम्पैक्ट को इतने अच्छे से प्रूफ कर दिया दैट वी वन दैट डिबेट. So even if your opening opposition mentions an impact, they can't necessarily win on it. They have to impact and they have to prove the importance of that impact. What's this harm? Why do you feel bad? You feel bad because self-worth harms, because identity harms, because you're not able to function, because constant comparison fucks you over, because there's like a lot of things that you're suffering from. This proves the viscerality that you're talking about. So what's the second lesson here? The second lesson here is, even if your opening brings out an impact, it's not true कि वो उसे prove करेंगे अच्छे से. You can extend on that impact. You can prove the importance of that impact. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to ensure that you're able to have the skills that you need to think about all of this yourselves. So that's why I started with like a theoretical framework. So you have the skills that you need. Now I'm talking about examples. You can apply those skills here. So the skills that I talked about earlier, if you apply them, you can use them within this motion and closing opposition, and you can win this debate, because then you can understand that it's not enough to say feel bad. It's more important to prove कि क्या harm है, to prove the impact क्या है उसका. So impact में ये एक चीज ये भी हो सकती है कि वो mention कर दे opening bench impact, you lay on it, or you might just have new impacts जिनकी बात भी नहीं हुई कभी. So you can have new impacts, just prove the importance of those impacts, and your analysis shouldn't be contingent on them. Otherwise you're dependent on them. You shouldn't ever be dependent on your opening benches. You should have new reasons for your stuff. So impact extensions, mechanistic extensions, both of them can win debates. I've given you tangible examples of like the recent competition I did and where I used these extensions to win that debate. Yeah, we can go on to the third one. All right, so this is an interesting one. Yeah, so new argument extensions. Sometimes you might just have a completely new argument, but then you have to think about, why didn't my opening bring this argument? Is this argument unprovable? Is this argument too tough to weigh? So whenever you have a new argument which just hasn't come before, it could be new carrick, new mech, new impact, just completely new stuff, जिसकी कभी बात ही नहीं होती में, you can have a completely new argument. Then you have to think about, what's the importance and what's the value of this argument. Is it the most important thing? Again, I'll go back to the first slide that I was talking about. Should the judge care about this? And you have to be honest with yourself. Even if you might think कि मुझे अच्छी लग रही है ये, just think from the perspective of the judge. Can the judge credit this? If you think कि नहीं यार नहीं हो सकती credit, then don't use it. The best metric, think if you can prove, can you win? If you cannot, don't run it. If you cannot win even after utopic thinking you can prove it, then there's no point in running it. All right, so how did I bring a new argument extension here? And like, this was an interesting debate. So this was Manzar round 3. This was the top room. So I'll give the example of the motion. The motion was, this house believes that the development organization should closely work with religious institutions in developing countries. So I was closing government in this motion. The motion is simple. Development organizations in general are charities, NGOs, international NGOs, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation. They can also be like for-profit infrastructural projects. But the debate that happened in our room essentially was mostly around donations and charity organizations. So even though development like debate around our case was around charities. So what happened within the opening benches? How did I strategically enter this debate? All right. So opening government started talking about key religious institutions have a lot of local knowledge, and when you use that knowledge you reach more people, you are able to help more people, because religious institutions on a local level have a lot of nuances, so there's a lot of effectiveness that exists. Opening opposition talked about ki hey no, religious institutions are coercive in nature, they'll control you, they'll not let you function अच्छे से, and probably there are religious institutions that probably hate modern medicine, so they won't let you like give out COVID medicines or like vaccines because they are antithetical and they're against it. So opening government was like, we'll make life of people better because efficacy increases, because productivity increases, because religious institutions collaboration is good. Opening opposition was like, no, the collaboration is bad. Religious institutions have bad incentives. Don't do it. How? So what did I strategically think when I was closing government, and how I was able to like win over my opening bench? I thought about the clash on opening government and opening opposition is around efficiency. Does the efficiency increase or does the efficiency decrease? So what I strategically thought about is no sides proves a large delta. Probably the interactions can be good, probably the interactions can be bad. Efficiency can be good, efficiency can be bad. Both sides have good reasons. But then the clash also washes out, right? Because opening government mentioned that charity organizations have billions of dollars. If they have billions of dollars, why do you need religious institutions for local knowledge? Because if you have billions of dollars, probably you can get local knowledge elsewhere. What did we bring as a new argument? Our argument was simple. We were like, we don't care about efficiency. Efficiency exists on opening government, on opening opposition. No sides proves larger extent may change. Probably they can function better. वैसे भी वैसे ही. What changes particularly? This is where our new argument entered the debate. What we particularly talked about is when people get charity through religion, they feel better. They feel emotional, psychological fulfillment, because then it doesn't feel like they're begging, then they don't feel like they are a commodity, then they feel like they have a purpose in life because the god is helping them. So what changes isn't that किसी को ज़्यादा aid मिल रही है, it's how they're able to grasp that aid. Because pain is not, because like suffering is not physical, it's also psychological and emotional. Because when I'm suffering, I'm also suffering emotionally because I feel like a bad person. So what we elaborated upon is that poor people in general go through a lot of moral dilemma. What's this dilemma? The dilemma is simple. Even though they are told by their religion that you are a good person and you should work hard, God's plan exists, their surroundings are bad, their sufferings are bad. So poor people are more likely to internalize and self-blame themselves that probably I'm in bad circumstances because I was a bad person, or I'm not a moral person, or the God doesn't love me. Because if God loved me, my life would be good. So this is the kind of self-harm that occurs where people like where self-blaming and self like pity at a point of time occurs, because you feel bad, because you feel like you were not a moral person, you were not a like healthy person. How do we change that? We change that because human beings are visual creatures. When you give aid through God, for example, if Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives medicines, mosquito nets, food through God, what changes is I'm now not getting like khana from a billionaire. I'm getting khana from God. I'm getting food, water, electricity, mosquito nets from God. This is what changes because the messaging changes. Because religious institutions, the way that they give aid is something which is different. Because जब आपको कोई पंडित और गुरु आके आपकी चैरिटी वगैरह देता है, वो आपको उसके साथ बताता है कि hey, this is something जो God की तरफ से आपको, God's plan exists and this is something you should care about. So this is what changes. So our impact was simple. We don't claim big changes like opening government, opening opposition. We just ensure people feel better about themselves. Because no side can actually solve suffering, right? Because suffering cannot be solved in this debate. But if we can solve how people perceive that suffering and how they deal with that suffering, we make their lives better. Because if I get charity to God through God, I feel like a moral person. I feel like my God loves me. My relationship with my God improves. I feel less sad and I feel better. How do we weigh this over our opening benches? The first metric we've used is we take the best case scenario of opening opposition. Notice this takes the best case scenario. Even if religion is bad, even if religion institutions are bad, even if religion is coercive, if some aid reaches, if even if not every single aid reaches these people, even if 100 रुपए की जगह 30 रुपए मिल रहे हैं लोगों को, या 100 किलो की जगह 30 किलो खाना मिल रहा है, you still feel better because you're able to rationalize your suffering. So it's not on the quantity of help that you like actually feel better, it's on the way that you get that help. This deals with the best case, because even if you get less help on quantity, you feel better because you rationalize it better. So we break that deadlock on opening bench. The second way we win this debate is we weighed it on certainty. This is a certain benefit we are talking about, because the benefit and the extent is clear. Opening government is uncertain. भाई रिलीजन से आप बात करोगे, रिलीजन आपको नुआंसेस देगा, एंड उससे बेटर है बिकॉज आप ज्यादा लोगों को रीच कर पाओगे, बिकॉज रिलीजन का लोकल नॉलेज है. दैट्स अनसर्टेन, because if you're a big organization you can take information from elsewhere. But what's the most certain thing? The most certain thing is we make people feel like psychological and spiritual fulfillment, and that's the most important thing. Then we also weight this on identity, like the last wing that I used. Insofar as you have to live with yourself 24/7, if you are your own source of pain, then you cannot escape yourself. So if you don't blame yourself, it increases the utility that you feel in your life, and you are able to cope with your suffering better. So it's the most important thing, because we make the life of the most vulnerable people better. We're not dependent on like the opening bench ka clash around effectiveness. Our clash is simple, you feel better. So through this we were able to beat our opening bench, and we were able to like win over them within this round. So I've given like three like different motions from the same tournament and different extensions that I specifically used. Yup, the fourth one. All right, so strategy extensions. um Yep, so strategy extensions are simple. A lot of times it's not necessary for your extension to be like a mechanism or an impact or like a new argument. Sometimes you might also win on strategy or like the things that you're using. All right, so I'll just talk about strategy extensions and what they're about. So I'll start with weighing extensions. Let's take a motion. This house supports the uh, dysregulation of the financial sector. Actually, I'll be back in like 1 minute. I have to go to the washroom. 1 second. Yeah, so we can take break for 1 minute. You can drink water and then we'll like recoup here. Yep, I'm back. Am I audible? Can someone confirm? Yep, thank you, Sanvi. I'll just send the motion in the chat box. All right. So, so through this example, I'll prove strategy of weighing extensions. So the motion is this house regrets deregulation of financial sector. So assume that on the opening bench you talk opening government, you talk about risk. So you regret deregulation because when you deregulate something the risk also increases, right? Because when there are less regulations on this, probably the credit risk increases, probably the systematic risk increases, probably the risk of default also increases. So opening government is likely to talk about ki, hey, risk increases because of all of these XX reasons. What is opening opposition going to talk about? opening opposition talks about कि hey, when you ensure कि regulation कम है, access to credit increases, right? When there are less regulations, more people get access to debt, more people are able to increase their quality of lives because insofar as they get access to more credit, more money, they can make their life better, they can use it for better circumstances. So OG's case is likely going to be about risk कि भाई risk बहुत ज़्यादा है, आप default कर सकते हो, banking system के लिए अच्छा नहीं है. Opening opposition is going to be like no, लोगों की लाइफ बेटर होती है क्योंकि अगर रेगुलेशन कम है आपको पैसा जल्दी मिलेगा, पैसा आपको जल्दी मिलेगा, आप उसे यूज करके अच्छी चीजें कर सकते हो. How can you strategically weigh and like use weighing extension as a metric in closing government? Even if you don't have completely new material, you can prove on closing government why risk is something which is more important than quality of life and then the quality and like the credit they were talking about. Because opening opposition will be like, oh, like if you have less regulation, vulnerable people can get more loans, vulnerable people can get more credit because they have less credit rating, so less regulation, more money for them. Closing government can weigh why risk is more important than what you say quality of life or like people getting access. So risk more important than access. Notice even though risk opening government mein aa gaya, but closing government can still weigh this. How can they weigh this? Number one, they can weigh this by talking about the fact that insofar as a financial crisis is more likely to occur because risk is something that's increasing, whenever a final financial crisis is likely to occur, the most vulnerable people are let off the earliest because they are the least in demand, which is to say the poorest of the poor lose their jobs the earliest insofar as a crisis is something which occurs. But secondarily, when a crisis occurs, your interest rate also increases, right? Because crisis में पैसों का वो होता है कि डर होता है बहुत ज्यादा, so लोन पे interest rate बहुत बढ़ जाता है. When that interest rate increases, probably the loans that you think people will get, that's something they're also not likely to get in the first place. So insofar as opening opposition's benefits are temporary, we think this crisis is more severe in nature because of the severity of harms that it causes. Notice you're not talking about a new mechanism. You don't have a new, like probably a new argument. You are just weighing opening government, but strategically you can use it to win this. So this slide is about you using different things to win, even if they might not constitute a new thing from the perspective of like just debates. You can weigh why one thing is more important because if opening government doesn't weigh risk, there's a parallel claim that exists, right? If you're in closing government, opening government ने risk proof कर दिया, उन्हें weigh नहीं करा. Opening opposition ने quality of life proof कर दिया, उन्हें weigh नहीं करी. Why is risk more important? You can weigh this. Abhi, whatever I was talking about, it's not a new argument. People suffering from crisis, like people being let off or interest rates increasing, its impact of the risk that opening government is talking about, but it proves the importance of it as well. So you can weigh your claims even if you are not the one who's bringing that claim out. So this is how you can change the criteria within that debate. And this is जो slide के starting में लिखा था, you can use new criteria to judge this debate. So insofar as you can give me comparative analysis, it's also a new meaningful contribution because you prove why risk is the most important thing. अब इससे think about the debates that you were in. You might not have a new argument, but if you can prove that opening government's impact is weighing wise better than opening opposition, you can still win this debate because you actually prove the metric that opening government set in this debate. So so the purpose of this like session is you should start thinking of multiple ways you can win this debate. Number one, mechanistic extension, just mechanistically filling the gap. Impact extension, having a new impact. New argument, having a new argument. Abhi weighing extension, I don't even have a new argument abhi. I just take the metric of opening government and I prove it's the most important. Risk is the most important due to crisis, due to unemployment, due to vulnerable people being harmed, due to the interest rates increasing. So the severity is very, very high. I take opening government's case and I win because I prove their case's importance. This is what weighing extension is. You don't have new stuff. You just prove it's the most important thing through several metrics. Obviously, the metrics should be different. Agar opening में metrics are, you cannot win on those metrics. The second way that you can win this, and इसका भी example I'll have, non-fulfillment of burdens. A lot of times opening government का केस बहुत सुंदर होगा, बहुत अच्छा होगा, but वो कोई burden मिस कर देंगे. Probably motion की wording ऐसी होगी कि they miss out on a burden, क्योंकि motion में कभी-कभी I told you ना कि significant आ जाता है, rise आ जाता है, fall आ जाता है, they drastically change the way that you need to operate within that motion. So कभी-कभी even if उनका prove अच्छे होता है, you can strategically extend by proving कि उन्हें fulfill ही नहीं करा अपना burden. उन्हें फॉर एग्जांपल अगर टीएचएस मोशन है, यू कैन से कि गवर्नमेंट ने तो फिएट ले ली, उनके पास फिएट थी नहीं। टीएचआर मोशन उन्होंने काउंटर फैक्चुअली नहीं दिया, दे डोंट प्रूव देयर बर्डन, दे डोंट प्रूव द पॉजिटिव एनालिसिस, दे डोंट प्रूव द लाइक्लीहुड एनालिसिस। सो यू कैन प्रूव एंड स्ट्रेटेजिकली प्लेस योरसेल्फ एंड से कि उन्हें बर्डन फुलफिल नहीं करे, दैट्स व्हाई वी शुड विन दिस डिबेट। इसका आई हैव एन एग्जांपल अभी लेटर जो मैंने एक डिबेट में करा था। ऑलराइट, सो द नेक्स्ट थिंग इज नैरेटिव डिबेट्स मेक स्ट्रेटजी व्हाट यू कैन अप्लाई। Yeah. So there's a subtle strategy that you can apply within narrative debates or within like regrets motions as well, जिनमें like कुछ चीज हो रही होती है और वो नहीं हो रही होती। For example, what narrative debate किस बारे में होता है? Narrative debate is about number one, who is spreading that narrative? Is it media? Is it leaders? Is it social leaders? Is it like mainstream media? Is it a politician? Who is like feeding that narrative? Is it the education system? So whenever you're in a narrative motion, think about the source where the narrative is coming from. But number two, who is that narrative affecting? So what happens essentially, कभी कभी ओपनिंग में आपको टाइम कम मिलता है, तो नैरेटिव डिबेट में भाई आप बहुत सारे लोगों पे इम्पैक्ट क्लेम कर लेते हो एंड यू आर वेरी वेरी अनरियलिस्टिक। सो योर इम्पैक्ट्स बिकम अनरियलिस्टिक बिकॉज नैरेटिव डिबेट में आप सोचते हो कि भाई ये नैरेटिव है, ऐसे सब इफेक्ट हो रहे हैं, चलो मैं इनकी लाइफ बेटर करता हूँ। बट कभी कभी पीपल स्टार्ट रियलाइजिंग भाई आपने उस पर इम्पैक्ट तो क्लेम कर लिया लेकिन वो उसे इफेक्ट ही नहीं कर रहा। क्योंकि कभी कभी क्या होता है, लोग नैरेटिव डिबेट को पता नहीं क्या बना देते हैं कि उससे लाइफ एंड डेथ हो जाएगी, ये चेंज हो जाएगा, वो चेंज हो जाएगा। बट नैरेटिव डिबेट इज जस्ट अबाउट अ नैरेटिव, इट्स जस्ट अबाउट अ परसेप्शन और एन आइडियोलॉजी। सब कुछ नहीं बदल जाता उससे। What you can do in closing government strategically is you can be more realistic. You can say कि we won't be uncharitable because and this is non-fulfillment of burden that I was talking about earlier. You can be like कि opening government doesn't fulfill their burden. They are very very unrealistic. Narratives ऐसा नहीं होता कि दुनिया बदल देते हैं. We have to be realistic. So this is how we'll be realistic. Number one, it only applies to some people, but the impact it causes to these people is very very bad. I'll explain through this one example as well. The example is simple. This house opposes glorification of youth. I'll write in the chat box. Yep. So assume that opening government starts running ki at a point of time you oppose glorification of youth, you are able to spend more time building pension schemes, retirement plans, because you are going away from youth. You're going, if you're not glorifying youth, probably focus on elder people increases. This means that political will for retirement plans, for provident funds, for just schemes that help older people are going to be better. Simultaneously, opposition talks about ki when you glorify youth, you start building universities, you start building schools, you start funding and investing within their skills or like developing their human capital. At that point of time, glorification of youth is important because when you glorify youth, you start focusing on what youth is studying, on the studies, universities, like skill set, education, etc. How can you enter closing government mein here? This is a random speculative example I'm taking. Closing government mein, you will be like, first of all, question the first thing that whenever you are in closing you should question is, does this motion actually affect the kind of change that they're claiming? Because a lot of times teams have wild claims but the motion doesn't change that, right? So agar main closing government mein hota, main sochta bhai, is this motion deciding retirement plans of people or is opening government unrealistic? I think opening government is unrealistic. Why? One narrative around youth cannot really decide ki retirement plans, provident plans kitne hote, right? Because political system and political policies जो parliament में implement होती हैं, वो हजारों factors से affect होती हैं. So this motion cannot be credited to the benefit opening government is talking about, because retirement plans can exist regardless, because narratives around protecting the youth, protecting the old, narratives around loving the elder people still exist. So we can claim the retirement plans तो वैसे भी होंगे. So inherence, so this is where inherence is important. Is this motion proving this one thing or is the team wild? मैं क्लोजिंग गवर्नमेंट में आके क्या बोलता, मैं बोलता opening government and opening opposition are unrealistic within this debate because political policies and like parliamentary policies are affected through thousands of narratives, and this narrative is not the tipping point for a policy to be implemented. So opening government is uncertain because retirement plans and provident funds इस narrative से नहीं बनते. Opening opposition is uncertain because universities by इस narrative से थोड़ी बनती हैं. Universities are built for thousands of other reasons. So no side can prove that. So what it is that we are opposing on closing government, here you can claim more certainty in your side. On closing government, you can claim that this narrative doesn't affect the political environment of this world. This narrative affects individuals. How does it affect individuals? When you glorify youth, you glorify beauty standards as well, because young people fulfill these standards to a larger degree. So insofar as you're glorifying youth, what then happens is beauty structures become more like stretched, and that causes people harm because people feel bad about themselves, because not everyone can be young at all points of time. So when youth is glorified and you're an older person, you feel bad about yourself because you feel unworthy, or you feel bad because you're not young, you're not glorified, you're not following the beauty structure. So insofar as that is true, we think we make people feel better. नोटिस ये स्ट्रैटेजी मैंने रिलीजन वाले मोशन पे भी लगाई थी भाई, ऊपर आके उन्होंने इतनी सारी रैंडम चीजें कर दी, इफेक्ट लाइक सब कर दिया. आई वाज लाइक नो, पीपल फील गुड अबाउट देमसेल्व्स. रिलीजन का पर्पस क्या होता है? Religion's purpose is to make people feel good. When God gives them that charity, people feel good. This seems very, very simple, but strategically it takes out opening benches. Here, specifically, also, people feeling good seems like a very marginal thing. No, it's the most certain thing, because political change is very uncertain. Then the metric that you strategically place your debate in is you prove panel opening benches are uncertain. We'll give you the most certain impact from this narrative because this narrative influences people. It doesn't influence the political ideology. This is how you strategically enter this motion. And that's how you can win narrative debates. So I've given you strategies around narrative debates में कैसे जीतना है, fulfillment of burdens, weighing extensions में कैसे जीतना है. You can apply these strategies across themes, across motions, and obviously you can develop your own strategies as well. These are some of the strategies that I particularly find useful and used within like tournaments as well. इसलिए I gave Manzar के examples that I did. Yep. Next slide. All right. So this is one of my most cherished debates. So this is World Debate Open 2022. The motion is this house supports trends of government imposed regulations, pushing full responsibility on producers for waste management. So this motion is about कि भाई government को regulations डालनी चाहिए waste management की, and that's good. So I remember कि so this is World Debate Open round 3. हमारे like our opening, we were just novice debaters back then, we were very, very new. Like हमारी opening government में there were Oxford की team, हमारी opening opposition में I think there was Princeton की team. So they were like very senior debaters, very, very pro debaters, and we were closing on like an Oxford की team. So obviously as novice speakers we were also very, very scared, and we didn't know कि भाई कैसे करेंगे because we were still very, very new then, 2022. What happened within the debate and how we were able to take a first within this round. So opening government had a lot of material. They proved every single impact. They proved every single mechanisms. We were shit scared on closing government. We were like, we don't have new material. We don't have a new impact. We don't have new arguments. What do we do? Because I'm genuinely not kidding. Any impact that we discussed, they ran it. How it's better for consumers, how it's better for climate, how it's better कि businesses को आप like responsible hold कर रहे हो, how it like rechanges the recycling industry because green industry is pushed because of this, how it changes the supply chains within it. So ऐसा नहीं है कि बस एक like supply chain में change हो रहा है, पूरी supply chain ही हम change कर रहे हैं, like waste management पूरी supply की line में हम कम करेंगे. So they ran a lot of impacts, they had a lot of stuff. What did we focus upon? And this is how we found our extension, not in case prep, in the debate. DLO comes up, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Leader of Opposition states, panel, opening government doesn't prove the likelihood of this. Because notice, and this is where motion burdens are important. This is a THS motion. This house supports motion. When it's a this house supports motion, you don't have fiat, right? Fiat is granted in THW motions. कि हमारी fiat हम अच्छे से implement करेंगे. When it's a THS motion, you need to prove likelihood. हमारी एक्सटेंशन सिंपली आई क्योंकि डीएलओ ने एक फेयर क्वेश्चन पूछा, पैनल ओजी ने लाइक्लीहुड नहीं दिया, ओजी ने सब प्रूफ कर दिया, उन्हें लाइक्लीहुड नहीं दिया. व्हाट डू आई डू व्हेन आई कम इन मेंबर ऑफ गवर्नमेंट? आई से पैनल opening government proves everything but they don't unlock their benefits. Why? Because insofar as it's not likely on opening government, they cannot prove the benefits that they have megged out. So they have a lot of analysis, they have 80 to 83 like level analysis. They cannot win because they don't have likelihood. How do we prove likelihood? And this is like the most simple thing we do. I start by mentioning that insofar as government is imposing these regulations, it's going to create a big deal in society because probably you will be held accountable in society. Why will you be held accountable? Number one, when you're imposing a big burden, it creates popularity and narratives within the society because media catches it, because mainstream media starts debating on it, because the leaders of the opposition party start holding you accountable. So the way that we make it out is when you're imposing a regulation, you have to take a hardline stance, because if you don't take a hardline stance, the opposition party will criticize you, the media will criticize you. So when you have to sell something to the people, you have to be extreme when you are selling it. So notice when we say we are extreme, हम opening government के benefits को ज़्यादा unlock कर देते हैं, because opening governments के benefits are dependent कि policies extreme होगी. We prove policy extreme होगी because government has to be accountable to people, and if the policies are not extreme, the call out that they face, the criticism that they face is going to be very, very large. What's the second likelihood we prove? The likelihood we prove is why this policy is going to be implemented in a good manner. How do we prove that? We prove that कि probably when government is implementing this policy, they get a lot of support from consumers, right? फॉर एग्जाम्पल, अगर मोदी की गवर्नमेंट आके मैकडोनल्ड्स को बोलती है कि आपको वेस्ट मैनेज करना है और सबको वेस्ट मैनेज करना है, इट मीन्स कि कंज्यूमर पे से बर्डन जाके मैकडोनल्ड्स पे शिफ्ट हो रहा है. दिस क्रिएट्स लॉट ऑफ पॉपुलैरिटी बिकॉज इट बिकम्स द बेसिस ऑन विच दे इंक्रीज देयर पॉपुलैरिटी. So government की popularity is going to be dependent on them carrying this out effectively. What happens? Any single news article that says कि आपने MNCs को accountable hold नहीं करा, you are going to face significant backlash because this is the basis on which you sold your popularity and you sold your policy to people. Because for you to get people's acceptance, you took a hardline stance. Now you have to justify that, because if you don't justify that, you won't get elected in the next term, because like governments are short termists, they have to show results. Any single news article which talks about the fact कि भाई गवर्नमेंट ने करप्शन करी है या गवर्नमेंट ने अपना काम अच्छे से नहीं करा या मैकडोनल्ड्स अभी भी बहुत वेस्ट जनरेट कर रहा है, it's going to make sure that your popularity suffers a lot and you're going to face a lot of backlash. So simply, we don't have like complex analysis. We prove that insofar as you're a government, you're accountable to people, you're accountable to opposition parties and the media structure, and the leaders are going to be accountable. So insofar as your popularity is dependent on this being carried out, if it's not carried out, you face a lot of backlash. This unlocks the benefits of opening government because it proves the likelihood. The likelihood is for you to get popularity, you have to sell this policy. For you to sell this policy, you have to ensure you actually carry it out. We prove that simple link. We actually win over them. So the rankings then became we came first and opening government took a second within this round. So essentially, so what's the lesson here? The lesson here is you don't always have to be complex. You don't always have to be like, oh, I have to be very creative. No, you have to just get the job done. I could have been very creative. I could have ran a random like waste management का कुछ principle बना के. I was, so this is where quality is important. Notice मेरे पास बहुत सारी quantity of mix नहीं है. As I stated earlier, I just have quality. I just found a gap, likelihood, I filled it. Nothing less, nothing more. I just got the job done. I'm not like, I don't have very marvelous impacts. I don't have a very imaginary impact. My simple thing is, I say कि भाई likelihood proof करेंगे, we'll win you this debate. So this is what judges credit. When we've thought of this extension, we thought कि judge would care about this because judge cares about likelihood. Notice I said ना कि you have to think कि would the judge care about this. So this is like me applying that strategy here. I thought the judge would care because likelihood is important, because without likelihood the judge will be like it's uncertain. So we thought the judge would care. We thought from the perspective of the judge. We were judge, so हमारे पास कोई extension नहीं थी, हमारे पास कोई argument नहीं थी. What we strategically did is we saw a lack in burden fulfillment. Notice उन्हें सब कर दिया, and this is एक बार last slide पे जाना. Yeah. So this is why strategy extensions are important. उन्होंने सब कुछ कर दिया, but they just missed a simple burden. And probably अगर उन्हें पता हो तो उन्हें burden miss करा है, वो 10 लाइन में 5 लाइन में वो करके जीत जाते हैं. But they miss that burden because like, and this is something you all need to remember. Even in top rooms against top debaters around the globe, no one is perfect. Everyone are going to make mistakes because you still have 14 minutes. So ऐसा कभी नहीं सोचना कि हमारे पास कुछ आने ही नहीं वाला, कुछ ना कुछ हमेशा आएगा, because no argument is foolproof, no impact is foolproof, no like ऐसा कभी नहीं होता कि closing कुछ कर ही नहीं सकती. ये strategy अपने mind से निकालना है, ये block हटाना है, because this is how we were able to beat like an Oxford level team with a simple extension कि भाई likelihood हम prove कर रहे हैं. So it's not the most glorious thing that wins you debates, it's the most relevant and the most certain thing that wins you debates. So what I want you to get out from this example is think about various strategies that you can apply and be very, very adaptable and present. When I was going member, my speech wasn't ready. Like ऐसी हालत थी, हमारा सारा मटेरियल जा चुका था कि मैंने बहुत जल्दी जल्दी दो लाइन में अडाप्ट करा है. सो माय स्पीच डीएलओ के एंड में जाकर लिखना मैंने स्टार्ट करा है, एंड मेंबर लाइक आई जस्ट सेड फ्रॉम माय ब्रेन बिकॉज आई डिडंट हैव एवरीथिंग रिटन डाउन बिकॉज सब कुछ इतना जल्दी जल्दी हो रहा था. तो डिबेट्स में ऐसा भी होता है, बहुत जल्दी जल्दी चीजें होती है. यू हैव टू बी वेरी वेरी अडेप्टेबल, यू हैव टू बी वेरी वेरी डायनामिक. कभी ये नहीं सोचना कि भाई मैंने केस प्रेप में ये सोचा था मैं चला देता हूँ ये. नो, यू हैव टू लिसन टू द डिबेट एंड यू हैव टू देन डिसाइड कि क्या चलाना है. बिकॉज ऑफन व्हाट हैपेंस कि केस प्रेप में जो डिस्कस करा होता है वो ओपनिंग खा जाती है, या वो रेलेवेंट नहीं होता, या डिबेट में कुछ नया मिल जाता है. बी वेरी वेरी डायनामिक, बी वेरी वेरी अडेप्टेबल, एंड do drills and like watch like matter videos, देखो अपना matter strong करो, newspaper पढ़ो, then you'll able be then you'll have new mechanisms, you'll have new arguments because you have read new like newspapers, you have watched matter की videos. और अगर किसी को भी वीडियो चाहिए भी है तो you can like privately message me also. I can send you videos on philosophy, I can send you videos on education, economics, international relations. A lot of videos exist on YouTube or like बहुत सारी free resources हैं, and top debaters around the world also take these sessions. So oh, acha, so I should have mentioned this earlier. The prerequisite to you getting better in extensions is also you increasing your knowledge base. Knowledge base ऐसा नहीं है कि भाई मैंने एक वीडियो देख ली मेरा हो जाएगा. It's a continuous process. So start creating curiosity, reading new articles, like newspaper laptop पे देख लिया, phone में देख लिए, और न्यू वीडियोस देख ली. जरूरी भी नहीं है कि डिबेट रिलेटेड. सो ऐसे बहुत सारी फिलोसफी साइकोलॉजी वीडियोस रैंडम चैनल्स पे भी आती हैं. जस्ट वॉचिंग दोज वीडियोस, जस्ट बीइंग क्यूरियस एनफ, सो यू विल स्टार्ट डेवलपिंग न्यू आइडियाज. सो अभी जैसे मैं सिचुएशन बता रहा हूँ कि भाई मेरे पास आइडिया ही नहीं है, then you'll not be in that situation. You'll have ideas, you'll have like new arguments, you'll have mechanisms because your knowledge base would be so strong. Obviously I'm giving you strategies कि बिना knowledge base के भी कैसे जीत सकते हैं. For example, जो मैंने motion की भी बात करी, likelihood and proving कि भाई government accountable है is not a knowledgeable thing. Everyone knows that, right? So strategy does win you debate sometime, but knowledge also helps. It's not कि without knowledge you cannot win. Strategy, as I've proven and I've given you multiple examples, without like me having specialized knowledge, I was able to win these debates. But still, it's important you build your knowledge base also for your general like life skills as well, not just debate related. Yeah, I think I thought I digress करेगा. Yup, Deepshika.
Yeah, so I have one question. What if you are CG in a debate or CO in a debate, but your OG does a framing that is very wacky or something completely different from what you are thinking in the debate? So, in this situation, what should you do as CG? Should you go with that framing or should you counter the framing? Will it be considered knifing?
ठीक है. Okay, so इसमें I'll mention the like very very extreme circumstances. So knifing generally होती है when you're directly contradicting the other team, but very very few circumstances में knifing is allowed. I'll state those circumstances. Number one, when your opening bench is squirreling the motion, then obviously you cannot defend that motion because it's a squirreled version. Again, when you're closing, you don't have to be like कि ओ मेरी ओपनिंग मैंने स्क्विरल कर दिया, ये सब मत बोलो. बस जाके रीजनेबल जो आपका बेस है और रीजनेबल जो फ्रेम है उस पर आर्ग्यू करके आ जाओ. So even when you are opposing their like frame or opposing their squirreling, you are not explicit about it. You are just like stating your things. Secondarily, like when your opening is factually wrong. For example, space ka motion and your opening is like कि भाई moon cheese से बना है. Like moon is made out of cheese. It's factually wrong. You cannot defend that. It's undefendable. You just ignore that. You go with the fair framing कि moon is made out of like I'm not sure कोई element या asteroid or something जो भी like जिन भी element से moon बना है, but it's not made out of cheese. So the learning here is एक तो again in your question also you can take an even if scenario. You can state कि okay, we think opening government's frame is fair and like this is something that we are consistent with, but even if we take a different frame, even if we interact with opening opposition, this is why we win this debate. So even if analysis can help you, because when you are taking even if analysis, it directly allows you to oppose your opening, but you're subtle about it. You're not like opening government is wrong, that's knifing. You're like opening government might be right, let's take the other scenario. Even if they are like, even if we take the other alternative, this is why it's still valid, this is why we still win this debate. So most cases में whenever you see this happening कि उनका frame थोड़ा weird सा है, take an even if scenario, because जो मैं extreme circumstance बोल रहा था most debates में नहीं होता. Most debates में टीम आके ये नहीं बोलेगी कि मून चीज से बना हुआ है, नहीं बोलेगी कोई टीम. Most debates में टीम आके ये नहीं बोलेगी क्या कहते हैं कि squirrel कर देगी motion. मैं एक बार squirreling का एक example दे देता हूँ just so it's clear. Squirreling is when you're debating on a definition which is undebatable. For example, if the motion is this house would shoot the president, obviously this debate is about shooting or killing the president. If government starts arguing that we'll click good pictures because we are shooting a picture of that president, that's undebatable, that's squirrel worthy. Then you start debating on the correct definition in closing benches. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. Oh, कि closing government, opening government बहुत पागल है. Judges understand that. You debate on the fair framing. You debate on कि shooting हो रही है तो कोई मर रहा है. We'll debate on that comparative. And उसमें बोल देना even if opening government is wrong, we'll take the best case scenario of opening opposition. So even if say you can interact with opening opposition का frame, you can contradict opening government in a subtle manner. So number one, take even if scenario. Number two, even if you're opposing them because they have a very weird definition or they are just undebatable, use the fair framing but use even if. So that's the thing that you can do, because judges would understand कि judges पागल नहीं होंगे कि अगर उन्हें आके कुछ factually false चीज बोल दी. So closing team shouldn't be penalized for that. But वो है कि you have to be you have to be subtle and strategic about it. Just don't say कि you're opposing it, just say you're taking even if, then you can do it. I hope it's clear, Dipshika.
Yeah, it's clear. I just have one more question. It's
Yeah.
motion specific question. So in THW motion and THR motions, uh, if THW motion mein OG gives a policy, but as CG, you also discuss some policy in your case prep. So in this situation, is it our burden to go ahead and support OG's policy or to introduce a policy that we thought about in case prep?
All right. So if you're closing, you shouldn't bring out a completely different or a new policy, because only like opening government gets the capacity to set up these policies as the prime minister, or like when they're defining that motion. Obviously, you can have your new arguments. Obviously, you can have your new impacts or your new analysis, but you shouldn't bring very radical changes to the policy जो opening government में नहीं है, because that's something that's in general not allowed in closing government. So if you have a different interpretation of that policy, don't like bring it out in terms of a different thing. Use the similar comparative that your opening government has set up, and you can have your new analysis, new impacts, वो सब ठीक है, but don't radically change the policy in opening, like because you cannot do that in closing. Opening ही कर सकती है वो. Yeah.
Also, on the idea of THR motion, if we are CO, then OG gives a counterfactual, tries to prove their likelihood. Now CG comes ahead and gives some other counterfactual, and now they're trying to prove their own likelihood, which is independent of what OG ran. So as CO, how should I then engage with them? Like which counterfactual to break, which likelihood to engage with, and
Okay.
proceed in the debate?
Okay, so I think इसमें दो circumstances हो सकते हैं. There's a chance कि opening government एक counterfactual लाई, closing government उस counterfactual को oppose नहीं कर रही, बस वो उसमें details और nuances डाल रही है and उसके through likelihood prove कर रही है. But अगर closing government ने अपना counterfactual बिल्कुल उल्टा दे दिया, एक तो they would be knifing opening government, तो that's something वो closing खुद ही नहीं करेगी. कि ऐसा नहीं होगा कि opening के counter में X चीज हो रही है, closing कहेगी हमारे में X चीज नहीं हो रही, Y चीज हो रही है. Because that's something वो फिर ये हो जाएगा कि you're changing or you're knifing because you're opposing their comparative. Generally what happens is you start adding nuances within comparatives. So as strategy, if you're closing opposition, you should interact, you obviously should interact with opening government as well, because only like they are setting the counterfactual, but you should also interact with the side जिसके likelihood analysis better है. तो ओपनिंग गवर्नमेंट ने हो सकता है अपने काउंटर फैक्चुअल का लाइक्लीहुड एनालिसिस दिया है, बट यू थिंक ये तो बहुत अनसर्टेन है, बट क्लोजिंग गवर्नमेंट हैज यूनिक रीजंस फॉर देयर काउंटर फैक्चुअल. सो इफ यू थिंक कि क्लोजिंग गवर्नमेंट के लाइक रीजंस अच्छे और लाइक वैलिड है, देन यू शुड रिबट दैट एज वेल. So you shouldn't leave it for the judge to decide कि उन्होंने कैसे counterfactual को like resolve करा है. You should obviously like, क्योंकि जनरली ये नहीं होगा कि बहुत radically different होंगे, थोड़े थोड़े differences होंगे, but you should also engage with closing government का likelihood analysis, because they might add new details or new nuances within that, or new impacts from that counterfactual. So it's good to rebut that as well and rebut opening का. Obviously you should prioritize जिसका likelihood better होगा. So if you think कि closing का likelihood better है, you should interact with theirs more, because there would require more responses. OG ने बस assert करा है तो उनका like uncertain है, closing ने reasons दिया तो you interact with that. Yes. ठीक है?
Yeah, so this happened is a tournament mein.
Okay.
Motion was this house regrets the rise of financial influencers, and OG was running ki the counterfactual is these financial influencers are largely people reaching out to audience through short-term content, and our comparative or binary is information through big investment firms and not through these like influencers to begin with.
Okay.
CG comes ahead and says what we'll do is our counterfactual is we'll make government more accountable and open like financial literacy programs and awareness among people so that they don't go for these financial influencers to begin with. So then what is the strategy with like CO to then engage, because these both of these counterfactuals were very different from each other.
अच्छा, so इसमें एक चीज है कि नोटिस ये दोनों कॉन्ट्रडिक्टरी नहीं है. सो ओपनिंग गवर्नमेंट्स एंड क्लोजिंग गवर्नमेंट का कैन बी ट्रू साइमल्टेनियसली. मतलब ऐसा नहीं है कि दे आर, ऐसा नहीं एक साइड बोल रही है कि गवर्नमेंट करेगी, एक साइड बोल रही है गवर्नमेंट कर ही नहीं सकती. सो दे आर एडिंग डिफरेंट नुआंसेस टू इट. इसमें आई फील लाइक लिसनिंग टू लाइक दीज, डिड दे गिव लाइक्लीहुड एनालिसिस एनी साइड? आई एम नॉट श्योर. दिया था किसी ने?
दोनों का ही काफी लैकिंग था.
अच्छा, सो अगर दोनों का काफी लैकिंग था, फिर तो जस्ट अ सिंपल कॉल आउट कि दे डोंट हैव अ लाइक्लीहुड एनालिसिस इज समथिंग दैट्स गुड ऑन सीओ प्रूविंग. बट another thing that you can do is you can give likelihood analysis for why the counterfactual is unlikely. So कभी कभी, so for example you can say कि गवर्नमेंट को 1000 चीजें करनी होती हैं, it's very very unlikely कि वो एकदम से प्रोग्राम स्टार्ट करेंगी insofar as they have a lot of stuff to do. So give, इसमें you notice you're not just saying कि उनके पास likelihood नहीं है, you're giving उल्टा analysis कि उनका comparative unlikely क्यों है. So on CO what you can do is not like, instead of just saying कि their counterfactual is like not proven, you can give analysis to say their counterfactual is unlikely. So you can say OG में कि you can OG को you can probably say कि probably like companies have a lot of other things to do. Like this is not their main priority. Investment firms care about their clients, ensuring वो सब होगा. This is something they don't do, and this is a radical change. I'm not sure why they will do it. So they cannot claim their benefits because they're uncertain. So just thinking कि likelihood को मैं unlikelihood में कैसे बनाऊँ, बताओ. And like, is that clear?
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. यप, तो हाँ मैं कहा था, यप, स्ट्रैटेजी एक्सटेंशंस में वही कि you can win on knowledge, you can win on strategy. It's better to have both in your arsenal so you can deploy which one whenever you need. Some debates you can purely win on strategy, some debates you might use your knowledge to win, some debates you might use strategy and knowledge. But strategy is very very important, because strategy and tactics are something which will separate you from other like new or inexperienced debaters. So if you make your strategy better, if you make your like tactics better, you can be a better debater, because strategy wins you debates. As I've given you like multiple examples. So ensure that you increase your knowledge base, you increase, like you do both. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, इसके बाद वाले. All right. So ये थोड़ी nuanced mistakes हैं that I've seen happen within novice debates, and you might also like have seen yourself like doing this the same like this exact same thing. So this is what I found when I was like judging abhi recently in different tournaments. These are the general mistakes I see novice debaters make. Number one, claiming new marginal impacts. So कभी कभी closing government या closing opposition बहुत smartly आती है, and they're like कि panel, opening government is right, but vulnerable लोग भी harm होते हैं इससे. सो ओपनिंग गवर्नमेंट ने सारा एनालिसिस दे दिया, क्लोजिंग गवर्नमेंट बस आके बोलती है कि भाई पैनल से पुअर लोग भी हार्म होते हैं, अब हमें डिबेट दे दो. पैनल इज लाइक, if the analysis you are using is opening government ka, even if you have a new marginal impact, you cannot win this debate. Because so the problem is novice debaters don't know how to use vulnerability. Vulnerability is not कि just कि हमने claim कर दिया और वो हो गया. You have to, number one, prove the extent of harm that is caused to these vulnerable people, but you also have to prove why they are the most important entities. Intuitively everyone might agree, but you have to prove why they are the most important. I can give you several reasons how you can do that. So number one, you can say vulnerable people suffer disproportionate harm on themselves, which is to say rich people have other alternatives, they have more money, they have more capacity. Vulnerable people don't have that, so we ought to care about them more. So what does disproportionate harm mean? So it means that 10% of change in a vulnerable person's income affects them a lot more than a 10% change in a rich person's income. Let's use an example. If अगर 10% से सबकी इनकम गिरती है, रिच बंदे की इनकम 1 लाख से 90,000 हो गई, बट एक पुअर पर्सन की इनकम 100 रुपए से वो 1000 रुपए से 900 रुपए हो गई. Notice that not like 100 rupees ka marginal harm is a lot more to the poor person, because it impacts their capacity to buy the resources or the goods and services that they need for their sustenance, which means electricity, food, water. So isse you can prove they're important because they face disproportionate harm, so we ought to care about them more, we are obligated to care about them more. But the most important thing is, whenever you're bringing out vulnerable actors, also have unique reasons for why they're harmed. Don't just be like कि opening government ने proof कर दिया, अब इससे poor लोग भी harm होते हैं. नहीं, you cannot win the debate on that, because judge will come and judge, like you might have heard this also, judge will be like, you are dependent on opening government. Never be dependent on any side. Give independent reasons, even if they don't seem very persuasive, for why poor people are harmed. So you can have different reasons for poor people are harmed. You're not dependent on ऊपर का analysis, you are dependent on your own analysis. So even if you think कि ऊपर से वाला persuasive analysis आ गया, have less persuasive analysis, but impact को अपने contingent अपने analysis पे try करो, उनके analysis पे नहीं, because otherwise you can come a second but you cannot come a first. Obviously in a very bad situation where you want to strategically take a second, do this. So you might not win over your opening, you might beat the other opposition benches. It, worst case strategic seconds I've also seen they can be good, but obviously I'm going to approach this from the perspective that you want to win the debate, not just take a second. Yeah. Secondarily, ये भी मैंने बहुत देखा है, slightly changing the frame. तो closing government smartly आती है, कहती है कि panel, ये debate developing countries में हो रहा है and वहाँ पे लोग harm हो रहे हैं, हमें debate दे दो आप. But it doesn't change इतना ज़्यादा, right? Even if you add nuances to the frame कि भाई developing countries में हो रहा है, and and I'm sure some of you have done these things जो मैं अभी mention कर रहा हूँ. You're like कि panel developing countries में होता है, वो हमें debate दे दो because वहाँ पे people ज़्यादा vulnerable होते हैं. But like analysis तो फिर भी opening government का है. So whenever you're talking about developing world, number one, you have to talk about the unique harms that only occur in the developing world. But number two, unique reasons, unique mechanisms, unique things within the developing world. You cannot use the general analysis of your opening and apply it to a different frame, because even within that frame you're dependent on that analysis. So you have to cut that umbilical cord and you have to have new analysis, so you're not dependent on them. So when you're changing the frame, prove the severity of the unique impacts or the unique harms that's caused to the people, and why that's severe and why that's bad and why that only happens on your closing side. Don't be dependent on opening analysis, otherwise you cannot just win the debate. Yeah. The third thing, boy, running new material without placement. I've talked a lot about placement and strategic commentary. इससे क्योंकि judge can understand कि what you're trying to do and the judge can care about it. If you just start your speech and you start running new material, it's confusing, it's irrelevant. You have to strategically place yourself in the debate. So when मैं likelihood वाले motion में बात कर रहा था, I placed myself in a debate in a manner कि यहाँ पे इनकी एक side है, यहाँ पे इनकी एक side है, इसने likelihood proof नहीं करा, तो I placed myself ऐसे करके कि इनका likelihood I'll proof. जब मैं वो उसकी बात कर रहा था कि like good things and you have to let go of good things and वो self defense mechanisms religion वगैरह की, I strategically placed myself. Opening government इधर थी, I placed myself by like judge को अब comparison पता है कि मैं क्या करना चाह रहा हूँ. So placement and like strategic commentary is very important. You have to ensure you get better at that, because then you can prove the relevance. Because ऐसे तो आके भाई कोई हजार न्यू चीजें बोल दे, लेकिन क्यों, कैसे, कहाँ, क्या क्या हो रहा है उनमें, क्यों important है वो. Importance and winning is something which is important. So वो I'll reiterate this. Think, can your argument genuinely win? Genuinely, like if you prove this, can this genuinely win? Like have like a serious pep talk with yourself, with your teammate. If you think it just cannot win even proven, then never run that argument. Focus on responses, because I think like inherently you would know. Obviously there's a chance you might not perfectly run the argument, but assume कि अगर वो perfectly चलती वो जीत सकती है नहीं. अगर you think वो perfectly चल के जीत सकती है, then you start building it and you make it perfect. Otherwise don't run it. So these are the general mistakes I see. Yeah, we can go on to the next slide. All right, thank you slide over. So I wanted to discuss just one more thing. So there are certain drills you can do to get better at extensions, because obviously like in a like one session I cannot like ensure that all of your skills are developed, all of your mindsets are opened. What are these drills you can use? So you can watch yep. When are we? Do you have a question? You can write in the chat box if you. Acha, I think she's rejoining. There might be some error. Yep, तब तक मैं drill बता देता हूँ एक बार. Yes, Anshika.
Hi, so I had a question.
Yeah.
How to do strategic preemptions like as opening benches so that you don't end up giving closing few ideas.
Okay. See, first thing वो ये है कि think about, ensure you don't leave any gaps. Yes, Anshika.
Sorry, that was my mistake.
Yeah. So whenever you're making an argument in opening, think about that you don't leave any gaps within those arguments. So वो कि ensure कि you are following a chain of logic. You are going from 1 से 2, 2 से 3, 3 से 4. Once you're not jumping to 4. So वो है. So इसमें one thing which is like intuitively important. Don't claim big impacts if you don't have a lot of analysis. Build your impacts धीरे धीरे करके through your reasoning. So you can do that. Secondly, like when you're opening bench, your priority can be कि मुझे भाई मैटर भी चलाना है जैसे क्लोजिंग क्लास मैटर ना बचे, but a more important priority is ensuring the importance of your arguments. So for example, अगर मैं opening पे आके मैं चला रहा हूँ कि पैनल इससे मैं लोगों की एजेंसी बढ़ा रहा हूँ, I can prove why that agency is the most important thing. Agency is the most important thing in your life because it increases the basket of choices that you have, because it leads to a more dignified life for you as a person, because insofar as you have more choices, you can increase the utility that you have within your life. So whenever you are in opening, your priority should be to prove the importance of your arguments. अब notice अगर मैंने prove कर दिया agency important है, अब closing आके हजार चीजें prove कर देगी, they have to wait over my agency. So whenever you're preempting, whenever you're making an argument in opening bench, ensure that you preemptively weigh your arguments. Judges को पहले से पता होना चाहिए why it's important. So वो same question जो closing होता है, why should the judge care about it? Why should the judge care about agency? Why shouldn't I care about, let's say, पैसा? Why shouldn't I care about, let's say, like लोगों की खुशी? Why should I care about agency, right? So you have to prove कि this is the most important thing. उसके अलग अलग wing metrics होते हैं, उसके अलग अलग तरीके होते हैं, but opening पे वो ये है, preemptively what you want to do is you want to run the most important and the most valuable claim. वो भी like experience के साथ आता है, वो भी धीरे धीरे like you can learn. But the most important thing is, even if you have two arguments with an opening bench, prove their importance. After you have proved their importance, then you start hitting random bullets at like closing a case. So कभी कभी होता है कि, for example, when you're in DPM, you start with proving the importance of the case. After that, you have 3 minutes left. Then you bring out new extensions. Just say closing a you can matter burn. So you can do multiple things, but prioritization is important. If you think matter burning is important because closing can run a lot of stuff, you can matter burn, but ensure you preemptively prove their importance. ये important है. Yes. I hope that's clear.
Understood. Thank you.
Yes. No worries. When are we any questions? Yes, Deepshika.
Yeah, so I have one. As closing benches, how to understand and prioritize A, important arguments that you need to engage with and must engage with, because you might not have time to engage with all the things that both the sides said.
Yeah.
Second, what are the trade-offs that you can make in the debate? Like, what are the flippable arguments that you should go? Is there any strategy, or it comes like solely with practice?
अच्छा, I think practice तो होता ही है, but strategies भी हैं इसमें. So for you to recognize the most important claim, so इसके कई तरीके हो सकता है. The most, एक तो intuitively there's some inkling that you would have. Probably if an argument is being made कि it increases the utility in people's life, और बाकी random arguments है, you would think कि this is the most important. But generally, the most important argument for a bench is जिसे वो weigh करता है. So when you are closing government and you're watching opening opposition, watch कि वो किस argument पे ज़्यादा time spend कर रहे हैं और वो किस argument को weigh करने की try कर रहे हैं कि this is the most important thing, it's the most certain thing, it's the क्योंकि हो सकता है उनके पास 4 arguments हो but वो 3 को weigh भी ना करें. So generally, what teams do in especially good rooms is they weigh their good arguments and their most important arguments. So how you can recognize कि this argument needs to be rebutted is notice कि if it's being weighed, if they're spending a lot of time on it. So because teams like good teams generally spend a lot of time on their good arguments, they want to build it up, they want to make it out. So if you think is this argument is something जिसमें बहुत time spent करा है and it's the most prime argument, then you debate, then you rebut it. The second way to recognize which is the most important argument is कभी कभी होता है कि 4 arguments होती है but वो एक पे dependent होती है. सो हो सकता है कि फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर मेरे पास पैसा आ रहा है, मैं पैसों से 1000 चीजें कर सकता हूँ. हो सकता है ओ की एक आर्ग्यूमेंट हो कि और मनी इंक्रीजेस, उनकी 3-4 आर्ग्यूमेंट हो कि हम इस मनी से हम चैरिटीज करेंगे, हम इस मनी से लाइक एथलीट्स का फायदा करेंगे, हम इस मनी से वेलफेयर प्रोग्राम्स चलाएंगे. सो कभी कभी व्हाट यू नीड टू डू इज यू हैव टू लुक आउट फॉर इंटरडिपेंडेंसी, because not all arguments are independent of each other, some can be dependent. So then you have to recognize what's the principal premise जिसके ऊपर हर चीज is built. अब इस एग्जाम्पल में when I was talking about कि if the argument is कि पैसा सब हमें पैसा मिल रहा है, हम इस पैसे से चैरिटी करेंगे, वेलफेयर करेंगे और स्पोर्ट्स एथलीट्स को देंगे, द प्रेमिस एक ही है, लाइक जो जो आपको मेंबर में डील करना है कि पैसा आ रहा है. इफ यू कैन प्रूव कि पैसा नहीं आ रहा है, पैसा कम हो रहा है, बाकी आर्ग्यूमेंट्स गेट साइमल्टेनियसली डिस्ट्रॉयड. So one way is to seek for is to recognize and look out for correlations, because arguments can be correlated and you then need to look out for the one which is at the top. So if the one at the top is पैसा, अगर हमने पैसे को ऊपर से काट दिया, गले से काट दिया, तो नीचे का सारा जो हार्म्स है वो चले जाएगा. So वो है one thing, look out for टीम किसमें सबसे ज्यादा टाइम स्पेंड कर रही है, किससे सबसे ज्यादा वे कर रही है. Secondarily, interdependence के लिए you can look out, and generally तो यही तरीका है that you can use. I hope that's clear. Deepshika.
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. Wait, I think I wanted to say one more thing here. Yes, हाँ, तो इसमें important चीज ये भी है, when you are in the, हाँ, drill भी करना है. Yep, so when you are in the member, it's important कि वो your focus shouldn't be on बहुत सारे extraneous rebuttals. Probably वो if you have a key rebuttal जो flip करता है चीजें, you can use that rebuttal. But other rebuttals, division of flavor में the whip can also do if you think they're important. So like Deepshika, when you were mentioning ना कि अभी कि we cannot interact with all claims, then you interact as if you are the member, especially you have to interact with the main premise or the main part of their case जिससे बाकी सारी चीजें flow हो रही हैं. The whip can do some work on the other arguments. Obviously whip को भी time देखना पड़ेगा अपना, but वो division of labor can also help. उसमें member सबसे main चीज से interact करेगा, बाकी वो उससे. The second thing that you can do within member speeches is you can integrate responses, right? You don't have to be extraneously rebutting, oh, this is one rebuttal, this is two rebuttal. Sometimes, and this is where you have to be very, very cognizant, your argument might be rebutting implicitly a point of opening opposition. So the opening opposition का point हो कि इससे आपको पैसे नहीं मिल सकते, your extension is कि आपको पैसे मिलेंगे. So you can integrate responses as well. इसमें note taking is important because एक page पे you will have your positive material. अब अब when you're reading your positive material, you'll recognize areas कि भाई उसमें मेरा एक integrated response है. इसमें color like coding is also good. What you can do is you can take a red pen and अपनी extension sheet के ऊपर ही वहाँ पे bracket में लिख दो कि I'll mention this integrated rebuttal. So what then you can do is even within your arguments, even within your extensions, you can mention the panel, notice when I prove this argument, this rebuts opening opposition ka point around paisa. Then you move on to your extension. So integrated responses help you in being time efficient because and इसमें भी strategic commentary करनी पड़ेगी क्योंकि जज को भी हमेशा समझना है कि क्या क्या रिबट कर रहा है, राइट? सो व्हेन यू आर ब्रिंगिंग आउट योर पॉजिटिव मटेरियल, उसके बीच में आल्सो यू कैन मेंशन कि पैनल नोटिस मेरी ये पॉजिटिव मटेरियल है, ये मेरे आर्गुमेंट है. अब if I prove this argument, उनका rebuttal is down, उनकी argument is down. This argument rebuts their point. If you mention that, the judge is going to be aware. The judge is going to write कि हाँ this rebuts it. Otherwise, you are at the whims or the fancies of the judge. तो judge को लगा कि भाई ये rebut कर रही है, वो लेगा, नहीं कर रही नहीं लेगा. So you have to be strategically comment, like you have to keep commentating for the judge. जिससे judge को you have to mold the mind of the judge simply. वरना you don't ever want कि judge खुद से सोचे. You want to ensure कि judge is thinking from your perspective, from your metrics. If you allow judge बहुत ज़्यादा leeway to think, वो आपको हरवा देता है. And then that's where it becomes very, very risky. So you can integrate responses in member, ensure कि extraneous बस 1-1.5-2 मिनट से ज़्यादा ना हो. उसके बाद integrated rebuttal तो हजार हो सकते हैं. It's just because उसमें you are not losing out on time. Your extension is coming out, then you are saying कि panel ये rebuttal है, ये मेरी extension है. So just clarity in that for the judge is also good. Yeah. So मैं drills पे आ जाता हूँ एक बार. The drill that you can use, obviously एक session से like ऐसा नहीं होगा कि everything radically changes. I hope कि लेकिन चीजें मिली हो that you can use. So the drill that you can use is you can go on YouTube and you can watch very, very good debates. So the first thing that you will need to do within this drill is case prep with your teammate from the perspective of the closing team. Abhi I told you na ki closing team ki like prep different hoti hai. Use those metrics and do case preps on motions that you find on YouTube. What is the next thing that you need to do? You watch the debate opening benches ka. You act like a closing team. अपने teammate को side में बिठा लो, laptop पे video लगाओ, opening government का PM DPM सुना, opening opposition का LO DLO सुना. After you have watched the opening benches, instead of hearing the member speech आप उस debate में, you become the member. So इससे you can understand the dynamics में how you have to evolve because you can go top rooms and top debates में opening government को सुनो, opening opposition को सुनो, and इससे your skills would also improve because हो सकता है opening government eats your material, then you have to bring out a new extension. So just like learning from that, and इसमें एक और अच्छी चीज ये है इस drill में, when you give out your member speeches, then you can hear the actual good top room member speech and उससे अपने आप वो compare कर सकते हो. So इसमें एक और चीज you can do when you search top debates, ये you can watch WUDC worlds के debates, you can watch EUDC के debates, UADC नहीं, वो तो AP है, EUDC के debates, you can watch world debates, you can watch Doxbridge Open, you can watch Harvard round robin के debates. There are like I would say 200-300 top level debates है. उसमें you can go ahead and उनकी description में जाके rankings देखो. If you see rankings जिसमें closing जीत रही है, उस डिबेट की क्लोजिंग बन के डिबेट करो. समझ रहे हो? क्योंकि इसमें ये स्पेसिफिक होगा. सो फॉर एग्जांपल इफ यू गो इन द डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ दैट वीडियो एंड यू चेक कि भाई इसमें क्लोजिंग जीत रही है, नाउ यू कैन यूज दैट क्लोजिंग टू लर्न एंड टू इंप्रूव. बिकॉज फॉर एग्जांपल यू ट्रीट योरसेल्फ एज सीजी. आपने ओजी सुना, आपने ओ सुना, अब you give your speech and you critique your speech. Now you can listen to the CG actual speech जो केस जीती है, जो win लाई है, and you can compare your material to closing government जिसका winning material था, and then you can improve ऐसे ऐसे करके. So this is a drill which is very good. It's कि you watch opening debate, you treat yourself as closing, you debate as closing, then you go ahead and watch the actual closing and you compare yourself to that and you improve. So I would hope कि this is a drill that you use because this drill can like मतलब is something that can improve you a lot as like boy just generally. And yeah, this is some boy. So दो तीन चीजें, just follow this drill, just increase your knowledge base because extension में वो भी help करता है. Increase your strategy, knowledge base and drills, you'll see a lot of improvement. कभी top room में scared नहीं होना कि भाई वो तो अच्छी टीम है वो हरा देगी, क्योंकि as I told you 2022 में जब मैं novice debater था, टॉप टीम ने इतना सिंपल लिंक मिस कर दिया एंड आई वन ऑन दैट. सो ऐसे होती हैं चीजें. नो टीम इज परफेक्ट. यू हैव टू थिंक फ्रॉम द पर्सपेक्टिव. बस फियर में नहीं रहना. हो सकता है एक पेज के साथ जाओ, हो सकता है खाली जाओ, लेकिन कॉन्फिडेंस से बोलना है एंड कभी डरना नहीं है एंड रिस्पॉन्सेज दे दो अगर वो है वर्स्ट केस. कभी ये नहीं सोचना कि हम कुछ नहीं कर सकते, ऐसी कोई सिचुएशन नहीं आएगी. आई हैव गिवन यू 4-5 ways of extending. You use whichever way works in whichever like round and you win on that and you improve on that. Yep. So any other questions? अगर हैं तो बता दो. I can wait for 30 seconds for any questions. Otherwise, we can